Welcome to this Azure Fundamentals AZ-900 practice question series. In this video, we will be going through 200 carefully selected practice questions designed to test your knowledge and boost your confidence for the exam. But that's not all. This is just one part of a much larger series. We have created over 500 exam style questions. So, to get the maximum benefit and truly master every AZ-900 topic, make sure you watch the other parts as well. Each question is explained in a simple, exam focused way to help you understand the why behind the answer, not just memorize it. So grab a notebook, stay focused, and let's prepare together to pass the AZ-900 exam with
You
confidence.
have an on-premise network that contains several servers and you plan to migrate all the servers to Azure. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that some of the servers are available if a single Azure data center goes offline for an extended period. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are scalability, elasticity, fault tolerance, low latency. The key thing here is you need to provide a solution which ensures the servers are still available even if an Azure data center is offline, which means we are looking for a solution that provides fault tolerance. So the right answer is option C, fault tolerance. Fault tolerance refers to the ability of a system to continue operating without interruption when one or more of its components fail. Moving on to question 2. You plan to migrate a web application to Azure. The web application is accessed by external users. You need to recommend a cloud deployment solution to minimize the amount of administrative effort used to manage the web application. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are platform as a service, software as a service, infrastructure as a service, or database as a service. The solution needs to minimize the administrative effort. So infrastructure as a service is automatically ruled out as it will require you to manage the operating system, middleware layer, or on top of infrastructure. With SaaS, you subscribe to an application, but in this case, you want to migrate your own application. So this is also not the right answer, which leaves us with two options, PaaS or database as a service. Database as a service is a distractor here as there is no such cloud computing model. So the right answer is option A, platform as a service. Platform as a service refers to cloud computing services that supply an on-demand environment for developing, testing, delivering, and managing software applications. There will be some questions in the exam related to cloud computing service models, and I have already created a detailed video around this topic. So you can refer to that video to understand this in more detail. I'll add the link to that video in the description of this one. Moving on to question 3. You have an on-premise network that contains 100 servers. You need to recommend a solution that provides additional resources to your users. The solution must minimize capital and operational expenditure costs. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are a private cloud, an additional data center, a hybrid cloud, full-blown migration to public cloud. The correct answer is option C, hybrid cloud. Hybrid cloud is the best choice in this case as the capacity is needed only for additional resources. And the other options of private cloud and additional data center will increase the capital expenditure significantly. Full migration to public cloud is a distractor here as the requirement is to provide a solution for additional resources. Moving on to next question. You are tasked with deploying Azure virtual machines for your company, and you need to make use of appropriate cloud deployment solution. You make use of software as a service. Does the solution meet the goal? You have to choose either yes or no. So the right answer is option B, no. Azure Virtual Machine is an example of infrastructure as a service. Question number 5. When you are implementing software as a service solution, you are responsible for which of the following? Your options are installing the SaaS solution, configuring high availability, configuring the SaaS solution, defining scalability rules. So the correct answer is option C, configuring the SaaS solution. With SaaS, cloud providers host and manage the software application and underlying infrastructure and handle any maintenance like software upgrades and security patching. You just need to configure the SaaS application before starting to consume it. Question number 6. Your company plans to migrate all its data and resources to Azure. The company's migration plan states that only platform as a service PaaS solution must be used in Azure. You need to deploy an Azure environment that meets the company's migration plan. You decide to create an Azure virtual machine, Azure SQL database, and Azure storage. Does the solution meet the goal? You need to choose between yes or no. So the correct answer is option B, no. Azure SQL database is an example of PaaS. However, Azure Virtual Machine and Storage are the examples of Infrastructure as a Service, IaaS, which means the correct option is no. If the question didn't have Azure Virtual Machine or storage in the options, then you could have chosen yes. So whenever you are having these sort of questions, you need to make sure that whatever options are mentioned there, all of them fall into that criteria. You will be in some situations where out of 3 options, maybe 2 are falling in that criteria and 1 doesn't. So the overall answer becomes no. Moving on to question number 7. Your company plans to start using Azure and will migrate all its network resources to Azure. You need to start the planning process by exploring Azure. What should you create first? Your options are resource group, subscription, virtual network, management group. So the right answer is option B, subscription. The hierarchy as per the Microsoft documentation is management group, subscription, resource group, and then resource. But management group is not a mandatory component in Azure as it helps you to manage access policy and compliance of multiple subscriptions. So the answer is option B, subscription. I have already created a detailed video around hierarchy in Azure. So you can refer to the video to understand how the hierarchy works in Azure in more detail. I'll link the video in the description of this one. Moving on to question number 8. Your company plans to deploy several million sensors that will upload data to Azure. You need to identify which Azure resources must be created to support the planned solution. Which 2 Azure resources should you identify? You need to choose 2 options here. Your options are Azure IoT Hub, Azure File Storage, Azure Queue Storage, Azure Data Lake. So the right answers are option A and option D, Azure IoT Hub and Azure Data Lake. Azure Data Lake can be used to store data from sensors, and IoT Hub can be used to process that data. You can refer to the links on my screen to read more about IoT Hub and Data Lake. Question number 9. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. You have multiple statements here. See, these statements are PaaS solutions provide full control of operating system that host application. PaaS solution provides additional memory to apps by changing pricing tier. PaaS solutions can automatically scale the number of instances. So the right answers are now on your screen. With PaaS, you don't get access to underlying operating system as it is managed by Azure. You do have different pricing tiers in PaaS where the configuration can be changed based on your requirement. And you can avail extra memory, CPU, and so on. PaaS solutions automatically scale whenever needed. Question number 10. You plan to implement an Azure database solution. You need to implement a database solution that meets the below mentioned requirements. Can add data concurrently from multiple regions, can store JSON documents. Which database service should you deploy? Your options are SQL Data Warehouse, Azure Database for PostgreSQL servers, Azure Cosmos DB, Azure Database for MySQL servers. So the right answer is option C, Azure Cosmos DB. In Azure Cosmos DB APIs for NoSQL, items are stored as JSON. Azure Cosmos DB is a globally distributed database system that allows you to read and write data from local replicas of your database. Moving on to question 11. If Microsoft plans to end support for an Azure service that does not have a successor service, Microsoft will provide notification at least 12 months before. Now, the instructions are that you need to review the underlying text here. If it makes the statement correct, then you need to select no changes needed. If the statement is incorrect, select the answer choice that makes the statement correct. So your options are no changes needed, 6 months, 30 days, or 3 months. So the correct answer is option A, no changes needed. Microsoft provides at least 12 months notice if support of an Azure service is ending and it doesn't have any successor. Question number 12. You have a resource group named RG1. You plan to create virtual networks and app services in RG1. You need to prevent the creation of virtual machines in RG1. The solution must ensure that other objects can be created in RG1. What should you use? Your options are Azure role, tag, Azure policy, lock. So the correct answer is option C, Azure policy. In this case, you will create a Azure policy which restricts the creation of virtual machine, and the policy will be applied to resource group, RG1 in this case. Moving on to question number 13. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. Your statements are, you must install the software that you want to use with IaaS, infrastructure as a service. You must apply software updates when consuming SaaS service. Azure Backup is an example of PaaS. So the correct options are on your screen. With IaaS, you are responsible for installing and managing the software on top of infrastructure. So the statement is true. Second statement is false, as with SaaS vendor is responsible for managing the underlying software and hardware, and consumers just subscribe to the service. Azure Backup is an example of PaaS service. Question number 14. You need to ensure that when Azure Active Directory users connect to it from internet by using an anonymous IP address, the users are prompted automatically to change their password. Which Azure service should you use? Your options are A, Azure AD Identity Protection, B, Azure Advanced Threat Protection, C, Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, also called as PIM. Option D, Azure AD Connect Health. So the right answer is option A, Azure AD Identity Protection. Identity protection allows organization to accomplish three key tasks: automate the detection and remediation of identity-based risks, investigate risks using data in the portal, export risk detection data to other tools. It detects risk of many types, including anonymous IP address use, which is what is talked about here, malware linked IP addresses, unfamiliar sign in properties, leaked credentials, password spray, and many more. Moving on to question 15. Your company's Azure subscription includes a basic support plan. They would like to request an assessment of an Azure environment's design from Microsoft. This is, however, not supported by the existing plan. You want to make sure that the company subscribes to a support plan that allows this functionality while keeping expenses to minimum. You recommend that the company subscribes to professional direct support plan. Does this solution meet the goal? You need to choose between yes or no. So the right answer is no. Even though professional direct will make you eligible to get architecture support from Microsoft, but the keyword in the question is you need to keep expenses to minimum. So this is not the correct option, as developer support, which is much cheaper than the professional direct, also makes you eligible to get general guidance related to architecture. So you need to look at the keywords when you are answering such type of questions. You already saw in this question that professional direct, even though makes you eligible to get that architectural guidance, but the keyword here was you need to minimize the cost, which is why no was the answer, because developer, even though being cheaper, makes you eligible for it. You can refer to the link on my screen to read more around the support plans available in Azure. Moving on to question number 16. Which two types of customers are eligible to use Azure Government to develop a cloud solution? Your options are a United States government entity, a European government entity, a United States government contractor, a European government contractor, a Canadian government contractor. So the correct answers are option A and option C, United States government entity and United States government contractor. Azure government is the mission critical cloud delivering breakthrough innovation to US government customers and their partners. Only US federal, state, local, and tribal governments and their partners have access to this dedicated instance, with operations controlled by screened US citizens. Moving on to question number 17. An Azure administrator plans to run a PowerShell script that creates Azure resources. You need to recommend which computer configuration to use to run the script. Which three computers can run the script? So you need to choose the three options here. Your options are a computer that runs Windows 10 and has Azure PowerShell module installed, a computer that runs Mac OS and has PowerShell Core 6.0 installed, a computer that runs Linux and has Azure PowerShell module installed, a computer that runs Chrome OS and uses Azure Cloud Shell, a computer that runs Linux and has Azure CLI tools installed. So the right answers are option A, C, and D. Options A and C are straightforward as they are combination of PowerShell installation on a supported OS. Option D talks about using Cloud Shell on Chrome OS. Cloud Shell can be accessed from any browser, which provides you option to use both Bash and PowerShell, hence making it the right option. Moving on to question number 18. Your company is planning to move from an on-premise environment to Azure, and you have decided to develop your application using Docker as the development environment. Which of the following is the best service to use for this scenario? Your options are Azure Virtual Machine, Azure Functions, Azure Container Instances, Azure App Service. The correct answer is option C, Azure Container Instances. It is a service that lets you run Docker containers on demand in a managed serverless Azure environment. Azure Container Services is a solution for any scenario that can operate in isolated containers without orchestration, run event-driven applications, quickly deploy from your container development pipelines, and run data processing and build jobs. Question number 19. What of the following are two characteristics of the public cloud? Your options are dedicated hardware, metered pricing, limited storage, unsecured connections, self-service management. The correct answer is option B and option E, metered pricing and self-service management. With public clouds, you pay for what you use, in turn providing you metered pricing, also called as pay-as-you-go model. Public clouds are self-managed service where you can use the portal to add, change, or remove resources based on your requirements. Question 20. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. Your statements are: with a consumption-based plan, you pay a fixed rate for all data sent to or from virtual machines hosted in the cloud. With a consumption-based plan, you reduce overall costs by paying only for extra capacity when it is required. Serverless computing is an example of consumption-based plan. So the right answers are on your screen. As the name indicates, consumption-based model is pay as you go. So first statement is incorrect. You only pay based on the amount of data transferred and how the data is transferred. Serverless computing is built based on per second resource consumption and execution. So yes, this is the example of consumption-based plan. Moving on to question 21. You have an Azure environment. You need to create a new Azure virtual machine from a tablet that runs the Android operating system. What are the three possible options? Option first, use PowerShell in Azure Cloud Shell. Option second, use Bash in Azure Cloud Shell. Option third, use Power Apps Portal. Option fourth, use Azure Portal. Option fifth, use the Security and Compliance Admin Center. So the right answers are option A, B, and D. All the three correct options require a web browser, and you can definitely install a web browser on a template using Android operating system, making them correct options. Moving on to question number 22. A company is planning on deploying Microsoft Azure resources to a resource group RG1, but the resources will belong to different locations. Can you have resources that belong to multiple locations in the same resource group? You need to choose between yes or no. So the right answer is yes. A resource group is just a logical container that holds related resources for an Azure solution. And the resources in your resource group can belong to various locations. You can go to this link to understand more about resource group and how they are managed and created. Question number 23. You plan to provision infrastructure as a service resource in Azure. Which three resources are example of IaaS, infrastructure as a service? Your options are Azure Web App, Azure Virtual Network, Azure Disk Storage, Azure Virtual Machine, Azure Logic App? The correct options are B, C, and D. Azure Virtual Network, Azure Disk Storage, and Azure Virtual Machine. You can refer to my video on Cloud Computing Service Model to understand more around IaaS. Moving on to question number 24. SLA in Azure is a formal agreement between Microsoft and customer. Which factor is covered in SLA? Your options are availability, scalability, elasticity, and durability. So the right answer is option A, availability. The service level agreement describes Microsoft's commitment for uptime and connectivity for Microsoft Online services. Based on this statement, availability is the factor which is covered in SLA. Moving on to question number 25. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1. You sign into the Azure portal and create a resource group named RG1. From Azure documentation, you have the following command that creates a virtual machine named VM1. You need to create VM1 in subscription 1 using this command. Now the solution you choose is from a computer that runs Windows 10, you install CLI from command prompt, sign in into Azure, and then run the command. You need to tell whether this solution meets the goal. The options are either yes or no. So the correct answer is yes. You can install Azure CLI on a Windows 10 machine and then use AZ login command to log in into Azure and create resources. Select the answer that correctly completes the sentence. An Azure web app that requires to connect to an on-premise Microsoft SQL Server is an example of which cloud? Your options are hybrid, private, multi-vendor, public. Let's first understand the type of clouds. First one is public cloud, where cloud computing services are delivered over the internet that can be shared with various people and organizations. Second one is private cloud, where cloud computing services are delivered over a private network and only accessible to users within your organization. Next one is hybrid cloud, which is a combination of public and private cloud, which is the most common model these days as it gives you the maximum flexibility. Multi-vendor is the combination of multiple public cloud vendors like Azure, AWS, GCP, and so on. Now, in this case, an Azure web app, which is Azure public cloud service, requires to connect to an on-premise SQL server, which is a private cloud. So the combination becomes a hybrid cloud. So the right answer is option A, hybrid. Moving on to next question. You can track your company's regulatory standards and regulations such as ISO 27001 from Azure Cloud Shell. Now the instructions are you need to review the underlying text. If the text makes the statement correct, you need to select no changes is needed. If the statement is incorrect, you need to select the answer choice that makes the statement correct. Your options are option A, no changes needed. Option B, Trust Center. Option C, Microsoft Cloud Partner Portal. Option D, Compliance Manager. So the right answer is option B, Trust Center. Trust Center provides in-depth information about security, privacy, compliance offerings, policies, features, and practices across Microsoft Cloud products. Question number 28. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. So the first statement is Azure provides flexibility between CAPEX and OPEX. Let's first understand what is CAPEX and OPEX. CAPEX or Capital expenditure, in layman terms, is company's long-term expense or upfront cost. Some of the examples of CapEx are physical data center, storage, or network costs, whereas operational expenditure, which is also called as OpEx, there is no upfront cost, but you pay for the service as you use it, which is why the first statement is correct, as all the cloud providers enable you to move from CapEx to OpEx model. Moving on to the next statement in the list. If you create two Azure virtual machines that use E2S underscore V3 size, each VM will generate same monthly cost. Both the virtual machines can have different monthly cost even after having same size, as they could have different disk or networking configuration attached to them. So the second statement is false. Next statement, when a virtual machine is stopped, you continue to pay storage costs associated to the virtual machine. While the VM is shut down, there is still a storage cost for the disk that is holding the virtual hard drive file, as well as any other data storage disks you may have created, as you are still consuming the file storage. If you delete them before shutting down the VM, then you won't be billed for storage. So this statement is correct. Moving on to next question. You have an on-premise application that sends email notifications automatically based on a rule, and you plan to migrate this application to Azure. You need to recommend a serverless computing solution for the application. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are server image from Azure Marketplace, Azure API app, Logic app, Azure Virtual Machine. So the correct answer is Logic app. The keyword here is they are looking for a serverless option, meaning option A and option D are automatically rejected, as both require you to provision a server. Now, Azure API app provides you a platform for creating apps, creating APIs. But in this, you need to migrate an already existing application, and this option will require code refactoring. So the right answer is Logic app, which is a serverless option and has options to send email based on triggers. Moving on to question number 30. Your company has an Azure subscription that contains resources in several regions. You need to ensure that users can create resources in only those regions. Your options are Azure policy, read-only lock, management group, reservation. So the correct answer is option A, Azure policy. Azure policy is basically a set of rules that you want to enforce across your organization. You can use it to restrict resource creation in certain locations, or you can even restrict creation of certain type of resources and many more things. I have already created a detailed video around Azure policies and initiatives, so you can check that out if you would like to understand this in more details. I'll provide the link to that in the video description as well. Question number 31. Match the Azure governance features to the correct description. The instructions are to answer, drag the appropriate features from the column on the left to its description on the right. Each feature may be used only once. So you do have 4 features listed there, but in the answer area, you have 3 statements only. So which means one of the option will not be used. Your features are Azure Blueprint, Azure Policy, Azure Resource Logs, Azure Tags. And the statements in the answer area are restrict which virtual machine types can be created in subscription, identify Azure resources that are associated with specific cost centers, deploy a complete Azure application environment, including resources, configuration, and role assignments. Now, I would like to give you a pause here on this video and try to think of the answers. So I hope you gave a pause and the answers are now on your screen. As I mentioned in previous question, you can use Azure policies to restrict the type of resources allowed to be created. And in this case, first statement takes an Azure VM in consideration. For the second statement, Azure tags. Basically, tags are metadata elements that you apply to your Azure resources. They are key value pairs and can be used to segregate resources based on certain criteria like department, cost centers, subsidiaries, and so on. And in this case, they are taking into consideration the cost center. Now, the third statement, which is Azure blueprints. A blueprint is a package or container for composing focus-specific sets of standards, patterns, and requirements related to the implementation of Azure cloud services, security, and design that can be reused to maintain consistency and compliance. Moving on to question number 32. You plan to deploy a website to Azure. The website will be accessed by users worldwide and will host large video files. You need to recommend which Azure feature can be used to provide best video playback experience. Which feature will you recommend? Your options are Azure Express Route Circuit, Content Delivery Network, CDN, Azure Traffic Manager Profile, Application Gateway. So the correct answer is option B, Content Delivery Network. It is a distributed network of servers that can effectively deliver web content to users. Question number 33. Your developers have created 10 web applications that must be hosted on Azure, and you need to determine which Azure web tier plan to use for hosting the web apps. The web tier plan must meet the following requirements. The requirements mentioned are web apps will use custom domains. Each web app requires 10 GB of storage. Web apps must run in dedicated computer instances. Load balancing between instances must be included, and cost must be minimized. Which web tier plan should you use? Your options are basic, standard, free, and shared. Now, key to answer this question is rule out answer options one by one based on the web tier plan requirements. Looking at the first requirement to use custom domains, option C is ruled out as the free tier doesn't support custom domains. Now, each web app requires at least 10 GB of space. So this rules out option D, shared, as it only supports up to 1 GB storage, leaving us with option A and option B. Now, the next requirement is to run web apps in dedicated compute instances, which is supported by both basic and shared. However, basic only supports up to 3 instances, whereas here you need to create 10, which means basic is also ruled out, leaving you with option B, standard, as the right answer. Moving on to question number 34. Select the appropriate option to complete the below sentence. Data that is stored in the archive tier of an Azure storage account. Your options are can only be read using Azure Backup, must be restored before the data can be accessed, can be accessed at any time using azcopy.exe, must be rehydrated before the data can be accessed. So the right option is option D. Data must be rehydrated before the data can be accessed. Archive tier is an offline tier optimized for storing data that is rarely accessed. and that has flexible latency requirements on the order of hours. Data in the archive tier should be stored for a minimum of 180 days. To read or download the data, you must first rehydrate data to an online tier, which can be either hot or cool. Data in the archive tier can take up to 15 hours to rehydrate, depending on the priority you specify for the rehydration operation. Now, there is a link on my screen. You can go to this link to understand more about access tiers. You might get some questions around different type of access tiers in your examination. Question number 35. Match the Azure services to their correct descriptions. Instructions are: to answer, drag the appropriate feature from the column on the left to its description on its right. Each feature may be used only once. Your options are: in the feature, you have 4 features again: Azure IoT Hub, Azure Functions, Azure Synapse Analytics, Azure Machine Learning. And in the answer area, you have 3 statements. The first one is provides serverless computing functionalities. Second one is process data from millions of sensors. And the third one is provides a cloud-based enterprise data warehouse solution. Now, again, give a pause here and try to think the answers before you see the solution. So the right answers are: Azure function is the first statement, that is provides serverless computing functionality. Azure IoT Hub is basically linked to process data from millions of sensors. And Azure Synapse Analytics provides a cloud-based enterprise data warehouse solution. Question number 36. Your company's Active Directory forest includes thousands of user accounts. You have been informed that all network resources will be migrated to Azure. On-premise data center will be retired post-migration. You are required to employ a strategy that reduces the effect on users once the planned migration is completed. The solution you choose is: you plan to sync all the Active Directory user accounts to Azure Active Directory AAD. Does the solution meet the goal? You need to choose between yes or no. So the correct answer is yes. You can sync your on-premise Active Directory objects to Azure using Azure AD Connect. Once the sync is completed, then the impact to users can be avoided whenever the on-premise data center is retired. Question number 37. Your company has an Azure subscription that contains the following unused resources. Your statements are: 20 user accounts in Azure Active Directory, 10 public IP addresses, 5 groups in Azure AD, 10 network interfaces. You need to reduce the Azure cost for the company. Now, the solution you gave is you remove the unused public IP address. Does the solution meet the goal? You need to choose between yes or no. So the correct answer is yes. You get charged for public IP addresses on an hourly basis. So removing unused public IP addresses will definitely save some money. Question number 38. You create a resource group named RG1 in Azure Resource Manager. You need to prevent the accidental deletion of resources in RG1. Which of the below mentioned settings would you use? Your options are: A, deployment slots, B, locks, C, policies, D, automation script. The correct answer is option B, locks. As an administrator, you can lock an Azure subscription, resource group, or resources to protect them from accidental user deletions and modifications. The lock overrides any user permissions. You can set locks that prevent either deletions or modifications. These locks are called delete and read-only locks. You can refer to the link on my screen if you want to understand more about logs and how they are applied on the resources. Question number 39. You have 1000 virtual machines hosted on the Hyper-V hosts in a data center. You plan to migrate all the virtual machines to pay-as-you-go subscription and need to identify which expenditure model to use for the planned solution. Which expenditure model would you identify? Your options are capital, elastic, operational, scalable. So the right answer is option C, operational. When you move from on-premise to cloud, then you trade from capital expenditure to operational expenditure. Question number 40. Your company plans to deploy an artificial intelligence solution in Azure. What should the company use to build, test, and deploy predictive analytics solutions? Your options are Azure Machine Learning Designer, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Cosmos DB, Azure Batch. So the correct answer is option A, Azure Machine Learning Designer. It is a drag and drop interface used to train and deploy models in Azure Machine Learning. It lets you deploy a real-time interface pipeline to an online endpoint to make predictions on new data in real time. Question number 41. Your company plans to automate the deployment of servers in Azure. Your manager is concerned that you may expose administrative credentials during the deployment. You need to recommend an Azure solution that encrypts the administrative credentials during the deployment. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Multi-Factor Authentication, Azure Key Vault, Azure Information Protection, Azure Security Center. So the right answer is option B, Azure Key Vault. Azure Key Vault can be used to securely store and tightly control access to tokens, passwords, certificates, API keys, and other secrets. Azure Key Vault has two service tiers, Standard, which encrypts with a software key, and a premium tier, which includes hardware security module, HSM protected keys. Question number 42. Your company has an on-premise network that contains multiple servers. The company plans to reduce the following administrative responsibilities of network administrators. The responsibilities are backing up application data, replacing failed server hardware, managing physical server security, updating server operating systems, managing permissions to shared documents. The company plans to migrate several servers to Azure virtual machines. You need to identify which administrative responsibilities will be eliminated after the planned migration. Which two responsibilities should you identify? Your options are backing up application data, replacing failed server hardware, updating server operating system, managing permissions to share documents, managing physical server security. When you move to Azure, you basically move into shared responsibility model. And depending on the cloud computing model you choose, the responsibility is shared between customer and Microsoft. It varies. However, you never have access to physical hosts. So replacing a failed server hardware and physical server security will be Microsoft's responsibility. So the right answers are option B and option E, replacing failed server hardware and managing physical server security. Now, there can be a variation to this question and say you are migrating to a PaaS service. Then in that case, even updating server operating system will be Microsoft's responsibility. If you don't know different cloud computing service models, and the variation in responsibility among different models, then you can watch out my detailed video on this topic. I'll add the link to the video in the description section of this one. Moving on to question number 43. You can deploy physical servers in which of the following cloud models? Your options are private cloud only, private cloud and hybrid cloud only, hybrid cloud only, private cloud, hybrid cloud, and public cloud. So the right answer is option B, private cloud and hybrid cloud only. Question number 44. You plan to deploy several Azure virtual machines. You need to control the ports that devices on the internet can use to access the virtual machines. What should you use? Your options are Azure Key Vault, Network Security Group, Azure Active Directory, Network Gateway. So the correct answer is option B, Network Security Group. A network security group contains security rules that allow or deny inbound network traffic to or outbound network traffic from several types of Azure resources. For each rule, you can specify source and destination, port, and protocol. Refer to the link on my screen to read more about network security groups. You can get some questions around this in your examination. Question number 45. Now let's have a look at some true and false questions. You can create group policies in Azure Active Directory. You need to select whether this statement is true or false. So this statement is false. Azure Active Directory doesn't support GPOs. If you are after GPOs, then you need to look into Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which is AADDS, which can be used to manage GPOs. Question number 46. Microsoft Office 365, Gmail, Dropbox are examples of SaaS, either true or false. So the statement is true. Moving on to question number 47. App Service, Azure Search, and Azure CDN are example of PaaS. So the statement is correct, true. Moving on to question number 48. Your company needs to run 10 Windows Server 2016 and 20 Linux virtual machines on a regular basis and remove them after their task processing is finished. Which Azure service should you use to minimize the administrative effort required to deploy and delete these virtual machines? Your options are Azure DevTest Labs, Microsoft Virtual Desktop, Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets, Azure Reserved VM Instances. The correct answer is option A, Azure DevTest Labs. These labs help developers and testers quickly create environments in Azure to deploy and test their applications. You can easily provision Windows and Linux machines in labs using reusable templates and artifacts while minimizing waste and controlling effort and cost. Question number 49. What do you call the strategy of layering multiple security defenses on top of each other to provide stronger protection than any single mechanism alone? Your options are Azure Firewall, Network Access Control, Azure AD Conditional Access, Defense in Depth. So the correct answer is option D, Defense in Depth. It is a strategy that employs a series of mechanisms to slow the advance of an attack that's aimed at acquiring unauthorized access to information. Each layer provides protection so that if one layer is breached, a subsequent layer is already in place to prevent further exposure. Question number 50. You are building an application using Azure and you need a service that sends push notifications from the backend. Which Azure service can meet this requirement? Your options are Azure App Service, Azure Signal Hours Service, Azure Notification Hubs, Azure Cognitive Search. So the right answer is option C, Azure Notification Hubs. Azure Notification Hubs is a massively scalable mobile push notification engine for quickly sending millions of notifications to iOS, Android, Windows, or Kindle devices, working with APN, GCM, WNS, and more. What is one point of entry that combines access to multiple resources behind it in federated identity management? Your options are single sign-on, single registration, proxy sign-on, flow control. Let's first understand what is federation. Federation is a collection of domains that have established trust. Now, the level of trust may vary, but typically includes authentication and almost always includes authorization. Day-to-day example of this scenario can be your company's intranet portal, where you don't need to sign in as it automatically authenticates you using the credential you used to log into onto your machine, which is called as single sign-on. So the correct answer is option A, single sign-on. In the world of Azure, you can use Azure AD to set up federated identity with multiple supported applications. One such example is within GitHub, where you log in into GitHub using the Azure AD credentials. Moving on to next question. What does it mean when an Azure service feature is in private preview? Your options are the feature is being beta tested by a limited number of Azure customers only. The feature is being beta tested by Microsoft Azure employees. The feature is being beta tested by Azure customers with enterprise subscription. The feature has finished testing phase and only available to Azure customers with enterprise subscription. There are basically three phases for an Azure service, which are named as private preview, public preview, and generally available. In private preview, Microsoft invites few customers to take part in early access to new concepts and features. This phase does not include formal support. In public preview, Microsoft allows any customer with proper Azure AD license to evaluate the new feature. Microsoft Customer Support Services will supply support services during this phase, but normal SLAs do not apply. And in general availability, the feature is open for any licensed customer to use and is supported via all Microsoft support channels. This is where the SLAs apply. Now, based on the above explanation, the correct answer is option C. The feature is being beta tested by Azure customers with enterprise subscription. Question number 53. A company wants to ensure its customer experience is minimally affected by any cloud resource failure while designing a cloud solution that will be deployed on Azure cloud. Which of the following benefits of cloud computing should the company prioritize in its design plan? Your options are agility, scalability, high availability, and elasticity. This is basically the definition of high availability. It is a quality of cloud computing infrastructure that allows it to continue functioning even when some of its components fail. And that is what is being asked in the question as a design requirement. Question number 54. Match the cloud computing benefits to the correct description. Now, on the left side, you have the benefits, and on the right side, you have some descriptions. So you need to drag the benefit from the left side to its description on the right, and the benefit can only be used once. The benefits are agility, geo-distribution, scalability. And the description statements are resources can be provisioned dynamically to meet changing demands. Applications and data can be deployed to multiple regions. Applications can be deployed, tested, and launched rapidly. So the correct answers are on your screen. Scalability is what resources can be provisioned dynamically to meet changing demands. Now, applications and data can be deployed to multiple regions is the geo distribution benefit. Agility matches with the description. Applications can be deployed, tested, and launched rapidly. Question number 55. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. So the first statement is a company can extend the capacity of its internal network by using public cloud. Yes, this statement is correct as this is an example of hybrid cloud model. Now the second statement is only guest users at your company can access the resources of the cloud in a public cloud model. Resources in the public cloud can be accessed by anyone from anywhere with appropriate credentials and authorization. So this statement is incorrect. A company must always migrate from a private cloud model to achieve a hybrid cloud model. No, the statement is incorrect. While hybrid cloud is a combination of public and private cloud, but it is not necessary to start with private cloud. You can always start with public cloud and then later on bring things in-house in a private cloud model. Question number 56. Select the answer that correctly completes the sentence. You can use Azure File Sync agent to sync on-premise data to an Azure. Your options are queue, file share, blob container, data lake, storage container. So the right answer is option B, file share. Now the Azure File Sync agent enables data on a Windows server to be synchronized with an Azure file share. Now you can refer to the link on my screen to understand Azure file share more detailed. Next question. What is the function of a site-to-site VPN? Your options are provides a connection from on-premise VPN device to an Azure VPN gateway, provides a dedicated private connection to Azure that doesn't travel over internet, provides a secure connection between a computer on public network and a corporate network. And then the last option is none of the above. A site-to-site VPN gateway connection is used to connect your on-premise network to an Azure virtual network over a IPsec VPN tunnel. This type of connection requires a VPN device located on-premise that has an external facing public IP address assigned to it. So based on this explanation, the right option is option A. The function of a site-to-site VPN is to provide a connection from an on-premise VPN device to an Azure VPN gateway. Moving on to next question. Your organization needs to develop a storage tier policy for data that is considered to be short-term data backup and disaster recovery. Which storage tier would you assign to this data? Your options are archive, warm, cool, or hot. So the correct answer is option C, cool. The cool tier is ideal for data that is accessed less frequently, but that still must be available for reading and writing. Some of the usage scenarios for cool tier include short-term data backup and disaster recovery, which is what is being asked in this question. Older data sets that aren't used frequently but are expected to be available for immediate access. Large data sets that need to be stored in a cost-effective way while other data is being gathered for processing. Next question. For each of the following statements, you need to select yes if the statement is true, otherwise you need to select no. So the first statement is each Azure subscription can contain multiple account administrators. You can have co-administrators, however, there can only be one account administrator. So this statement is incorrect. An Azure subscription can contain multiple resource groups. Yes, that's correct. A subscription can have multiple resource groups. If you want to understand more about nesting of subscriptions, resources, and resource groups in Azure, then look at my video related to hierarchy in Azure. I'll add the link for the video in the description of this one. The third statement is an Azure subscription can be managed by using a Microsoft account only. You need an Active Directory account to manage a subscription, not a Microsoft account. An account is created in the Azure Active Directory when you create the subscription. So the statement is incorrect. Question number 60. At which layer of OSI does Express Route operate? Your options are layer 3, layer 2, layer 7, layer 5. So the correct answer is option A, layer 3. Express Route operates at network layer of the OSI model, which is layer 3. Now, there can be another variation to this question where instead of mentioning layer 3, 5, or 7, they can give the names of layer like network layer, transport layer. So you should know which layer of OSI is corresponding to which name. Question number 61. Which resource can be used as a source for a network security group inbound security rule? Your options are service tags only, IP addresses only, application security groups only, and the last one, IP address security tags and application security groups. So the correct answer is option D. Any IP address, CIDR block, service tag, or application security group can be used as a source for network security group inbound security rule. Now, if you have heard what I just said, there can be a variation to this question where they can include CIDR block in the options as well. Question number 62. You are an administrator who must assign a role to a new employee. The employee needs to be able to have read-only access to all resources. Which role should you assign the employee using the principle of least privilege? Your options are user access administrator, reader, contributor, owner. So the correct answer is option B, reader. The built-in reader role must be assigned to the employee as it gives access to view all the resources and doesn't allow him to make any changes to those resources. Other roles mentioned in the option will provide user more than the required access. Question number 63. Which factor always increases your network cost no matter how your Azure topology is constructed? Your options are port speed, the amount of inbound data, data transfer within same availability zone, the amount of outbound data. Now, inbound data transfer and transfer within same availability zone are always free. You are charged for outbound data transfer or egress. These charges vary depending on whether this is the inter-region data transfer or outbound to internet. I suggest you to go through the link on my screen to understand different scenarios when it comes to inbound and outbound data transfer, as there can be multiple variation to this question. Question number 64. What is the longest term for which you can purchase your Azure reserved VM instances? Your options are 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, or 5 years. So the correct answer is option C, 3 years. Reserved instances provide discounted reservation rates for 1 or 3-year term commitment. So the correct answer in this case is option C, 3 years. Now, there can be a variation to this question where the ask is on a shortest term. And in that case, the answer would be option A, 1 year. So you need to always read the options very carefully because a slight change in a keyword will change the answer. Question number 65. Which Azure service provides a graphical way to model business processes as a series of steps? Your options are API apps, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Service Fabric, Azure Functions. The right answer is option B, Azure Logic Apps. Now, Logic App provide a graphical way to model your business processes as a series of steps or workflow. You can visually create workflows using Azure Logic App Workflow Designer in the Azure portal, Visual Studio Code, or even in the Visual Studio as well. Question number 66. Which of the following permissions you need to delete an Azure blueprint? You need to choose 3 options, and the 5 options are on your screen. So the right answer is option A, B, and option D. Now, option C is the permission that is needed to unassign a blueprint, and option E is the permission needed to publish a blueprint. Whenever you have such sort of questions where you need to choose the permissions, look carefully at the options that have been given, as all the options are almost similar. If you look at this question clearly, all 5 options, the first half is same. So make sure you are reading the question till the end and then choose the options. Question number 67. You have an Azure subscription and multiple Windows 10 devices. You need to ensure that only users whose devices have latest security patches installed can access Azure AD integrated applications. What should you implement? Your options are Azure Bastion, Azure Firewall, Azure Policy, and Conditional Access Policy. So the correct answer is option D, Conditional Access Policy. You can use Azure AD conditional access policies to achieve this requirement. However, you need to remember that conditional access policy alone can't be used to achieve this. And you will have to rely on the compliance status of the device, which is set by Microsoft Intune compliance policy. Question number 68. For each of the following statements, you need to select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, you need to select no. So the first statement is, a user account can be assigned to multiple Azure roles. Yes, you can assign a user account to multiple Azure roles. A resource group can have the owner role assigned to multiple users. Yes, multiple users can have owner role on a resource group. The third statement, you can create custom Azure roles to control access to resources. Yes, you can create custom roles in Azure if the built-in roles don't meet your requirements. Question number 69. Which built-in role gives you access to manage blueprint definitions but not assign them? Your options are blueprint operator, blueprint contributor, owner, contributor. So the right answer is option B, blueprint contributor. Blueprint contributor role lets you manage blueprint definitions but not assign them. Now there is a link on my screen and I would suggest you to go through this one to understand permission assignments related to Azure Blueprint in more details. There can be some questions around this in your exam. Question number 70. Select the statement which is true about Azure China. Your options are Azure China is operated by Microsoft. Workloads deployed in Azure China can be accessed from China only. Azure China is a physically separated instance of cloud services located in China. Azure China doesn't have a feature parity gap with Azure Global. Now read the statements carefully and you need to make sure you are choosing the statement which is true about Azure China. So the right answer is option C. Azure China is a physically separated instance of cloud services located in China. Regarding the other options, it is opposite. That is, Azure China is operated by a partner named 21 Vianet. The workloads that are deployed in Azure China can be accessed globally, and Azure China does have a feature parity gap. However, the gap is narrowing now. I've already created a detailed video around regions in Azure, as there can be few questions around this topic in exam. So check out the video to understand this in more detail. Next question. You have an Azure virtual machine that is accessed only from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. each day. What should you do to minimize costs but preserve the associated hard disk and data? Your options are resize the virtual machine, scale down the virtual machine, delete the virtual machine, deallocate the virtual machine. The keywords here are you need to minimize cost but preserve the associated hard disk and data. So option C is not valid, as this will lead to data loss. Now option A and B will lead to reduction in cost, but might lead to performance issues and will not offer the cost benefits as compared to deallocation. So the most appropriate option in this case is to deallocate the virtual machine in the time frame outside of what is mentioned in the question. Question number 72. Your company has an Azure subscription that contains the following unused resources. The resources are 20 user accounts in Azure Active Directory, 10 public IP addresses, 5 groups in Azure AD, 10 network interfaces. You need to reduce the Azure cost for the company. Which of the following unused resources should you remove? Your options are public IP addresses, network interfaces, Azure AD groups, Azure AD user accounts. So the correct answer is option A, public IP addresses. You get charged for public IP addresses on an hourly basis. So removing unused public IP addresses will definitely save some money. You would have also seen a variation to this question in the previous part of the series. Now let's look at some yes or no questions. The first one, your company is planning on hosting resources in Azure. Is it possible for outside users to have access to these resources in Azure? Yes, you can use Azure AD B2B feature to achieve this. With B2B collaboration, you can securely share your company's applications and services with external users while maintaining control over your corporate data. Question number 74. You can use availability zones in Azure to protect Azure virtual machines from a region failure. No, this is incorrect, as availability zones are within an Azure region. To protect from region failure, you have a concept called region pairs, where each region has a static pair and resources are failed over to the region pair in case of a regional failure. Question number 75. Companies can increase the service level agreement guaranteed uptime by purchasing multiple subscriptions. SLAs don't depend on number of subscriptions, so it won't increase if you purchase multiple subscriptions. A company needs to deploy their servers to the Azure cloud. The server's network segment must be segregated in order to comply with the company's security policy. Which is the most efficient way to deploy a server that meets this requirement? The first option is deploy to another resource group. Deploying to another resource group doesn't mean there is network segregation, so this option is incorrect. The next option is expand to another AZ. Now, expanding to another AZ will provide you with high availability. However, as option A, it won't provide you with network segregation. The next option is use a different account to isolate resources. Creating resources in different accounts can provide you with network segregation, but this is not the optimal or effective way to achieve network segregation. This leaves us with option D, which is the correct answer. You need to deploy a new Azure virtual network. An Azure virtual network is a representation of your own network in the cloud. It is a logical isolation of the Azure cloud dedicated to your subscription. You can use VNets to provision and manage virtual private networks in Azure and optionally link the VNets with other VNets in Azure. You can also link them with your on-premise IT infrastructure to create hybrid or cross-premise solution. Next question. Select one of the options to complete the statement below. If the resource group named My Resource Group has a delete lock, your options are: the delete lock must be released in order for the administrator to delete the My Resource Group. Only members of Global Administrator Group can delete My Resource Group. Administrator needs to add an Azure tag in order to delete My Resource Group. Administrator needs to change Azure policy in order to delete My Resource Group. Let's start by looking at option D first. It talks about a change in Azure policy, and policies are used for implementing compliance and organizational rules across your subscription or resource group. So this option is incorrect. Now, option C talks about the use of tags, which is used for grouping of resources, which again makes it an incorrect choice. Option B talks about global resource administrators. Global administrators will have access to delete the lock itself, but the resource group cannot be deleted unless lock is released, which means option B is incorrect. And the right option is option A. The delete lock must be released in order for the administrator to delete the My Resource Group. Question number 78. Your company needs to run multiple Windows 2019 server and Linux virtual machines on a regular basis and remove them after their task processing is finished. Which Azure service should you use to minimize the administrative effort required to deploy and delete these virtual machines? Your options are Azure Reserved Virtual Machine Instances, Microsoft Virtual Desktop, Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets, Azure DevTest Labs. The correct answer is option D, Azure DevTest Labs. Azure DevTest Lab is a service for easily creating, using, and managing infrastructure as a service, virtual machines, and platform as a service environments and labs. Labs offer pre-configured bases and artifacts for creating VMs and Azure Resource Manager templates, also called as ARM templates, for creating environments like Azure Web Apps or SharePoint Forms. Question number 79. Select the answer that correctly completes the sentence. When you are implementing a software as a service SaaS solution, you are responsible for. Your options are defining scalability rules, configuring high availability, installing the SaaS solution, configuring the SaaS solution. With SaaS, cloud provider hosts and manages the software application and underlying infrastructure. And they also handle any maintenance like software upgrades and security patching. Users just connect to the application over the internet, usually with a web browser or their phone, tablet, or PC. User is just responsible for ensuring user access to the application is governed by the policy of the organization, which basically means set up both authentication and authorization. So the correct answer is option D. They are responsible for configuring the SaaS solution. Now there is a link to the video on my screen. I have already created a detailed video explaining the different type of cloud computing models. I would suggest you to go through it, as there will be few questions around cloud computing service models in AZ-900 exam. I'll put the link to this video in the description of this video as well. Question number 80. Match the Azure service with their correct description. You need to drag the appropriate service from the column on the left to its description on the right. And a thing to note is each service can only be used once. The services are IoT Hub, IoT Central, Azure Sphere. And in the answer area, the statements are a managed service that provides bidirectional communication between IoT devices and Azure. Second statement is a software and hardware solution that provides communication and security features from IoT devices. And the third and final statement is a fully managed SaaS solution to connect, monitor, and manage IoT devices at scale. So the first statement matches IoT Hub. IoT Hub is a managed service hosted in the cloud that acts as a central message hub for communication between an IoT application and its attached devices. You can connect millions of devices and their backend solutions reliably and securely. Almost any device can be used to connect to an IoT hub. The next statement matches with Azure Sphere. Azure Sphere is an application platform with built-in communication and security capabilities for internet-connected devices that are owned by Microsoft. And the third and the final statement matches with IoT Central. IoT Central is a ready-made UX and API surface for connecting and managing devices at scale, delivering reliable data for business insights. It pre-assembles platform as a service offerings, bringing together each service beneath it for an easy to configure, comprehensive, and secure IoT offering. Question number 81. Which of the following is the least expensive storage replication option? Your options are geo-zone redundant storage, locally redundant storage, zone redundant storage, and geo-redundant storage. So the right answer is locally redundant storage. LRS is the lowest cost redundancy option and offers the least durability compared to other options. LRS protects your data against server rack and drive failures. However, if a disaster such as fire or flooding occurs within the data center, all replicas of a storage account using LRS may be lost or unrecoverable. To mitigate this risk, Microsoft recommends using zone redundant storage or geo redundant storage or geo zone redundant storage. So to sum it up, LRS is the least expensive replication option. However, since it only copies data locally, so it's not an option which provides you with high durability. And if that's your requirement, then you need to look at other three alternative replication options. But for the scope of this question, since we are looking for a least expensive storage option, locally redundant storage is the right answer. Next question. Now we are going to look at some straightforward yes or no questions. So the first one is Azure Active Directory lets you set dynamic membership rules. You need to choose either yes or no. So the right answer is yes. This is a correct statement. You can create attribute-based rules to enable dynamic membership for a group in Azure Active Directory. Key thing to note here is this feature requires an Azure AD Premium P1 license. So if you are on a trial license, you won't be able to use this functionality. Next statement. Azure Cloud Shell can be accessed from a web browser on a Linux computer. Yes, the statement is correct. You can access Cloud Shell from a browser, and it doesn't really matter which operating system you use as long as a web browser can be installed on it. Next statement. Authentication is the process of establishing which level of access an authenticated user of service has. No, the statement is incorrect. This is the definition of authorization. Authentication, on the other hand, is the process of verifying the identity of the user. Question number 85. What should you use in Azure Sentinel to see visualization of an incident in relation to alert and entities? Your options are workbook, investigation graph, connector, analytics rule. The correct answer is option B, investigation graph. The live visual graph displays entity relationship extracted automatically from the raw data. This enables you to easily see connections across different data sources. The investigation graph provides you with visual text from raw data, full investigation scope discovery, built-in investigation steps. You can refer to the link on my screen to understand more about investigation graphs. Moving on to next question. Which of the following can you use to view which user turned off a specific virtual machine during the last 14 days? Your options are Azure Access Control IAM, Azure Activity Log, Azure Event Hubs, Azure Service Health. The correct answer is option B, Azure Activity Log. It is a platform log in Azure that provides insight into subscription level events. The activity log includes information like when a resource is modified or a virtual machine is started. You can view the activity log in the Azure portal or retrieve entries with PowerShell and the Azure CLI as well. Activity log events are retained in Azure for 90 days and then they are deleted. So there can be multiple variation to this question. Let's say maybe they have a question where they are asking you what is the default retention period for logs in Azure activity log. Then the correct answer is, you can see on my screen, 90 days. Then they can give you another example. Here they are talking about when a virtual machine got turned off. But as you can see in the explanation, it also tracks when the virtual machine was started. So the question can be tweaked a bit to check when it was turned on or when a resource was modified. So there can be slight variation to this question. Moving on to question number 87. You need to implement a serverless solution satisfying the below requirements. You only pay for the time that your code runs. Execution is triggered via HTTP request. Which Azure service should you use to implement this requirement? Your options are Azure SQL Database, Azure Functions, Azure Virtual Machine, Azure Database for PostgreSQL. This is a very straightforward question where the answer directly lies on the keyword serverless. Option C is automatically ruled out as having a Azure virtual machine is not serverless. Now, option A and option D are database options and not something which let you run the code. So leaving us with option B, Azure Functions is the correct answer. Now, functions are built based on the total number of request executions each month. Some of the triggers for a function can be a queue, timer, event grid, or an HTTP request. So, like the previous question, there can again be variations to this question. The second requirement in this question is execution is triggered via HTTP request, but it can be modified because the triggers can be a queue, a timer, a event grid, or a HTTP request. So whenever I'm trying to give you explanation, you should listen the explanation carefully, because in the answers I'm trying to explain that there can be multiple variations of the questions as well. So in just one question you have seen 4 variations, so effectively you got to know 4 questions. Question number 88. Which Azure component provides information about Azure service incidents and planned maintenance so you can take action to mitigate downtime? Your options are Azure Monitor, Azure Security Center, Azure Advisor, Azure Service Health. So the right answer is Azure Service Health, option D. There is a link on my screen. You can refer to this link to understand more about service health and how these planned maintenance and service incidents are communicated. And you can enable yourself to mitigate downtime. Question number 89. A company is considering using Linux-based Azure container instances to deploy a simple application. The application runs as a stateful application. Which service can be used to provide storage to retrieve and persist data? Your options are Azure Blob Storage, Azure Disk Storage, Azure Archive Storage, Azure Files. Again, let's look at keywords here. The first one being Linux-based Azure container instances. The next one, a stateful application. And finally, storage needs to persist data. So straight away, the correct answer is option D, Azure Files. When you look at the link I have on my screen, the first line regarding containerization has all the keywords. Always remember, it will be very easy for you to answer questions in these fundamental examinations if you get yourself good at spotting the keywords in the question. So the key to answer or succeed in these examinations is spotting keywords and reading things carefully. Don't rush through the questions. Question number 90. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. The first statement is, if you assign permissions to a user to manage a resource group, the user can manage all resources in that resource group. Yes, that's correct. If you apply any permission on the resource group level, then the permission gets inherited to the resources contained in that resource group. Next statement, if you assign a tag to a resource group, all the resources in that resource group are assigned the same tag. No, this statement is incorrect. Unlike permissions, which we discussed in previous statement, resources within a resource group don't inherit the tags. Next statement, all the resources deployed in a Azure resource group must use the same Azure region. Again, no, the statement is incorrect. Resources can be deployed in multiple locations and reside in same resource group. They can also be deployed in any location, irrespective of the location of the resource group. Next question. Azure Sentinel uses Playbook to perform which of the following tasks? Your options are automatically respond to threats, monitor Azure services, maintain security certificates, run PowerShell scripts. The correct answer is option A, automatically respond to threats. Azure Sentinel can immediately respond to threat with minimal human dependencies when utilizing playbook. Some of the examples can be respond to an analytics rule that indicates a compromised user as discovered by Azure AD Identity Protection. It can also respond to an analytics rule that indicates a compromised machine as discovered by Microsoft Defender for endpoint. So what I'm trying to convey with these examples is Azure Sentinel depends on many other services to retrieve data and does respond to threats based on the data that is provided by other services. In the first example, it is dependent on Azure AD Identity Protection. In the second example, it is dependent on Microsoft Defender for endpoint. So it works in coordination with different Azure services to respond to threats. Question number 92. Which feature of Azure Monitor allows you to visually analyze telemetry data by integrating with Visual Studio? Your options are service health, alerts, application insights, metrics. Keyword to answer this question are telemetry and Visual Studio. Whenever you see these two together in Azure, then you should look for application insights. Application Insights is an extension of Azure Monitor and provides application performance monitoring APM features. APM tools are used to monitor applications from development through test and into production. Question number 93. Which of the following is required to access Azure Cloud Shell? Your options are virtual machine, Azure Web App, Azure Containers, storage account. So the correct answer is option D, storage account. Cloud Shell requires a storage account to host the mounted Azure file share, which is used to persist files across sessions. You can refer to the link on my screen to understand more about how a storage account plays a role in hosting Azure Cloud Shell. Next question. Which of the following Azure service provides serverless workflow orchestration to let you integrate apps, data, systems, or organizations? Your options are Azure Bot Service, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Functions, Azure Event Grid. Now the keyword here are you need to look at a serverless service that lets you build workflows to integrate apps. Now, as soon as you hear serverless, then you might think about functions in Azure, but you need to focus on other keywords, which is workflow as well, because of which the correct answer is option B, Azure Logic Apps, and not Azure Functions. Azure Logic Apps is a cloud platform where you can create and run automated workflows with little to no code. By using the virtual designer and selecting from pre-built operations, you can quickly build a workflow that integrates and manages your apps, data, services, and systems. So what we learned from this question is don't stop at just looking at the first keyword. Go through the whole question and see whether there is any other keyword as well. If you stop midway, then as soon as you find first keyword and don't read the question after that, then it might be possible that you are interpreting the keyword in a wrong way. So always read the question carefully before choosing the option. Moving on to next question. A company needs to implement Azure policies to automatically add a watermark to Microsoft Word documents that contain credit card information. Which Azure service can they utilize to implement the requirement? Your options are Microsoft Defender for Cloud, Azure Identity Protection, Azure Information Protection, Azure Active Directory Identity Protection, Microsoft Sentinel. Let's spot the keywords again in this question. Now, the first one is watermark. Then there is a mention of Microsoft Word documents. Then we have another keyword, credit card information. So this question has three keywords. Now, when you look at credit card information, it's talking about sensitive information. And the service that does this for us in Azure is AIP, Azure Information Protection. So the right answer is option B, Azure Information Protection, which is a cloud-based solution that enables organization to classify and protect documents and emails by applying labels. One such example is your administrator might configure a label with rules that detect sensitive data such as credit card information. Now, in this case, any user who saves credit card information in a Word file might see a tooltip at the top of the document with a recommendation to apply the relevant label for this scenario. Your developers have created a portal web app for users in the Miami Beach office. The web app will be publicly accessible and used by the Miami users to retrieve customer and product information. The web app is currently running in an on-premise test environment. You plan to host the web app on Azure. You need to determine which Azure web tier plan to host the web app. The web tier plan must meet the following requirements. The website will use the miami.wayland.com URL. The website will be deployed to two instances. SSL support must be included. The website requires 12 GB of storage and cost must be minimized. Which web tier plan should you use? Your options are basic, standard, shared, and free. Whenever there is a question where you need to choose the right web tier plan, then just focus on plan requirements and everything else is most likely a distractor. In this case, you can see the website requires 12 GB of storage, due to which free, shared, and basic plans get eliminated. Thus, the remaining option, standard, is the correct answer. Free and shared only support up to 1 GB of storage, and basic supports up to 10 GB of storage, making them incorrect options because the requirement is at least 12 GB of storage. Question number 97 of the series. Your company plans to deploy several web servers and several database servers to Azure. You need to recommend an Azure solution to limit the type of connections from the web servers to the database servers. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are a local network gateway, an Azure service bus, network security groups, a route filter. So the requirement is to limit the type of connections from web layer to database layer. In a traditional on-premise environment, you would use something like a firewall to establish the connectivity, to limit the connectivity. And in the case of Azure, that thing can be implemented by the use of network security groups. You can use an Azure network security group to filter network traffic between Azure resources in an Azure virtual network. A network security group contains security rules that allow or deny inbound network traffic to or outbound network traffic from several type of Azure resources, which is something a firewall does for us in a traditional on-premise environment. So the correct answer in this case is option C, network security group. Let's look at next question now. To complete the sentence, select the appropriate option in the answer area. Now you have a statement. When planning to migrate a public website to Azure, you must plan to, your options are pay monthly usage costs, deploy a VPN, pay to transfer all the website data to Azure, reduce the number of connections to the website. So the correct answer in this case is pay monthly usage costs. Whenever planning to migrate a website to Azure, you must plan to pay monthly usage costs. This is because Azure uses the pay-as-you-go pricing model. So you only pay for what you use. And you also need to remember that transferring inbound data to Azure is free of cost. So inbound transfer is always free, whereas the outbound transfer is charged based on where you are transferring, whether you are transferring within the regions or you are taking the data out of Azure. It varies based on the requirement. Moving on to next question. Conditional access uses signals collected from a user during the sign-in process to decide whether to allow or deny user request. You need to tell whether this statement is right or wrong. This is a correct statement. As you can see in the diagram on your screen, certain signals like user location, device they are using to access, they can be used to allow or deny access to them. These signals can even be used to force users to authenticate using MFA. As you can see on the middle of your screen, that there is a require MFA option as well. So if the user is not doing an MFA, their login access will be blocked. Moving on to next question. Identities stored in Azure Active Directory, third-party cloud services, and on-premise Active Directory can be used to access Azure resources. Again, you need to choose between yes or no. Yes, that's the correct statement. Third-party cloud services and on-premise Active Directory can be used to access Azure resources. This is called as federation. Federation is a collection of domains that have established trust. The level of trust may vary, but typically includes authentication and almost always includes authorization. A typical federation might include a number of organizations that have established trust for shared access to a set of resources. Now, if you want to understand about federation in Azure Active Directory more and how it is implemented, there is a link on my screen which will be available in the description section of this video to go through.
Before we proceed, folks, I would like to introduce you to my TopMate profile. If you are seeking guidance on clearing certification exams, considering a career transition into DevOps or cloud computing, or require support with resume reviews or mock interviews, you can easily schedule a one-to-one session with me via TopMate. You will also find digital products available for purchase, including PDF version of all the certification questions featured on the channel. PDF will be available for download instantly as soon as purchase is completed. For any specific queries, feel free to use the priority DM option. I will respond as soon as possible. Do not forget to take advantage of the tips and coupon codes available at the top of my TopMate profile to enjoy these benefits at minimal cost. Friends, link to my TopMate profile is available in the description section of this video.
Deploying your own data center is an example of CapEx. Again, you need to choose between yes or no. Yes, this is a correct statement. Deploying your own data center is an example of CapEx. This is because you need to purchase all the infrastructure upfront before you can use it. Now, talking about the second term, which is OpEx. OpEx, there is no upfront cost, but you pay for the service product as you use it. And cloud is one of the biggest examples of OpEx. Now, I already have a detailed video around what are the differences between CapEx and OpEx and how they vary from each other and in which model they are preferred. There is the link to that video on your screen, which will again be available in the description section. If you are interested in learning more about CapEx and OpEx, go through the video. Which of the following should you use to evaluate whether your company's Azure environment meets regulatory requirements? Your options are Azure Service Health, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, Azure Knowledge Center, Azure Advisor. The correct answer is option B, Microsoft Defender for Cloud. It continually compares the configuration of your resources with requirements in industry standards, regulations, and benchmarks. The regulatory compliance dashboard provides insight into your compliance posture based on how you are meeting specific compliance requirements. Next question. What is guaranteed in an Azure service level agreement for virtual machines? Your options are feature availability, bandwidth, uptime, performance. And the correct answer in this case is uptime. SLAs define Microsoft commitments for uptime and connectivity for Microsoft Online Services. If you are someone who is interested in knowing about the SLAs, then you can refer to the link on your screen. It will give you an option to download the current and archived editions of the SLA, and it covers Azure, Dynamic 365, Office 365, and Microsoft Intune as well. Let's look at next question of the series. You plan to map a network drive from several computers that run Windows 10 to Azure storage. You need to create a storage solution in Azure for the planned map drive. What should you create? Your options are a virtual machine data disk, a file service in a storage account, a blob service in a storage account, an Azure SQL database. So the correct answer is option B, a file service in a storage account. Azure Files is Microsoft's easy-to-use cloud file system. Azure File shares can be seamlessly used in Windows and Windows servers. To use an Azure file share with Windows, you must either mount it with, which means assigning it a drive letter or mount point path, or you can access it via its UNC path. Question number 105. Your company has several business units. Each business unit requires 20 different Azure resources for daily operation. All the business units require the same type of Azure resources. You need to recommend a solution to automate the creation of the Azure resources. What should you include in the recommendations? Now you can see you are talking about a template. Basically, you want to create same resource multiple times and automate things at the same time as well. So you are talking about something closely related to templates. And out of the 4 questions that are there on your screen, option D is Azure Resource Manager templates, also called as ARM templates. So the correct answer in this case is option D, ARM templates. If you are interested in knowing more about ARM templates, I highly recommend you to go through the link on my screen now. If you are someone who works with infrastructure as a code, you would already be familiar with this if you are dealing with infrastructure as a code in Azure. But there are other third-party tools as well. Apart from ARM templates, you can use Bicep, which is Microsoft's new official language that is a replacement of ARM templates going forward. You can also use Terraform as well, but that is out of the scope of this video. So let's focus to the ARM templates at this point. Question number 106. Which node in the Azure portal should you use to assign a user the reader role for a resource group? Your options are User Access Management, Policy Hub, Access Control or IAM, User Role Management. The correct answer is option C, Access Control. On your screen, you can see a screenshot I took while assigning role for a resource group. The resource group name here is automation. No matter if the question talks about a role other than reader, then still the answer would be same. Whether you are assigning a reader role or you are assigning any other role, you will follow the same process when you are assigning role to a resource group. On the left-hand side in the ribbon, you can see access control IAM. Once you click that, then you get an option of add. After you click on add, you get add role assignment, and then you can choose the role and select it. Let's look at next question of the series. To deploy an application to a number of Azure virtual machines, you should create a universal group. Now there are some instructions for you. Review the underlined text. If it makes the statement correct, select no changes needed. If the statement is incorrect, select the answer choice that makes the statement correct. So if you think the statement is correct, you need to choose no changes needed. And if you think the statement is incorrect, then you need to choose the right option. Your options are A, no changes needed, B, resource, C, deployment, D, security. So this statement is definitely not correct. The correct answer is C. There is something called deployment group in Azure DevOps. A deployment group is a logical set of deployment target machines that have agents installed on each one. Deployment groups represent the physical environments, for example, dev, test, or production environment. A deployment group is just another grouping of agents, much like an agent pool. If you are someone who has worked on TeamCity or Jenkins for their continuous integration, you would already be across the terms like agent pools, where you create a pool of agent. Your agent pool can be something like the agents that are used for production or test environment deployment, or it can be a combination of Mac agents, Linux agents, or Ubuntu agents, so on. You can do the grouping based on your requirement. Moving on to question number 108 of the series. Your company has a software assurance agreement that includes Microsoft SQL Server licenses. You plan to deploy SQL Server on Azure virtual machines. What should you do to minimize licensing costs for the deployment? Your options are configure Azure cost management budgets, deallocate the virtual machine during off hours, use Azure reservations, use Azure hybrid benefit. The correct answer in this case is option D, use Azure hybrid benefit. Hybrid benefit is a licensing benefit that helps you to significantly reduce the costs of running your workloads in the cloud. It works by letting you use your on-premise software assurance enabled Windows Server and SQL Server licenses on Azure. Let's now look at another variation of this question. If Windows Server or Microsoft SQL Server licenses covered by which of the following, you can repurpose the licenses on Azure virtual machine. As I've explained in the previous question, so you would already know the correct answer in this case is the last one, which is software assurance. Now you need to remember that there can be multiple variations of the question that you are seeing here. You can just reword a question and a new question will come up. So try to pay attention to the questions that are on your screen. Do not try to memorize them, and instead try to understand what is being asked in the question. That will help you to a greater extent in getting prepared for your exam and applying things in the practical environment. I'm sure you wouldn't want to just pass an exam, but you would want to apply things in practical life as well. So it is always advised that instead of learning the questions or answer, you try to understand what is being talked about here and try to apply it in your practical experience. Let's move to question number 110 of the series. A premier support plan can only be purchased by companies that have an enterprise agreement, EA. You need to choose between yes or no. Yes, the statement is correct. A premier plan can only be purchased by companies that have enterprise agreement. You can manage an on-premise Windows server as an Azure resource by using which of the following? Your options are Azure Arc, Azure AD Connect, Azure VPN Gateway, Azure Pipelines Agent. The correct answer is option A, Azure Arc. It is a service that allows you to manage on-premise servers and other resources as part of your Azure hybrid environment. With Azure Arc, you can use the same tools, APIs, and portals that you use to manage Azure resources to manage your on-premise resources as well. Azure Arc even lets you manage servers hosted in other cloud providers as AWS or GCP. Let's look at next question of this series. Which of the following uses inbound and outbound rules to filter network traffic to and from Azure resources connected to Azure virtual networks? Your options are internal load balancer, application security group, network security group, public load balancer. The correct answer is network security group. You can use an Azure network security group to filter network traffic between Azure resources in an Azure virtual network. A network security group contains security rules that allow or deny inbound network traffic to or outbound network traffic from several types of Azure resources. For each rule, you can specify source and destination, port and protocol. Let's look at some yes or no questions now. Trust Center provides information about the Azure compliance offering. You need to tell whether the statement is right or wrong. Yes, this statement is correct. You can improve composite SLA by adding redundant services to your application. Again, you need to tell whether the statement is right or wrong. Yes, this statement is also correct. All Azure services in private preview must be accessed by using separate Azure portal. No, this statement is incorrect. Private preview features are also accessed using the regular Azure portal. However, you will need to sign up for the feature. This is typically by invite only and issued directly by the product team responsible for the feature or service. Question number 116 of the series. Which of the following is Microsoft's managed network security service in Azure that protects Azure virtual network resources? Your options are Azure Bastion, Application Security Group, Azure Sentinel, Azure Firewall. The correct answer is Azure Firewall, which is a cloud-native and intelligent network firewall security service that provides the best-of-breed threat protection for your cloud workloads running in Azure. It is a fully stateful firewall as a service with built-in high availability and unrestricted cloud scalability. In case you want to learn more about Azure Firewall, then follow the link on your screen, which will be available in the description section of this video. Next question. There are 4 options available and you need to choose which of them is an Apache Spark based analytics service. Your options are Azure Data Factory, Azure DevOps, Azure Databricks, Azure Synapse Analytics. And the correct answer is Azure Databricks. It is a fast, easy, and collaborative Apache Spark based big data analytics service designed for data science and data engineering. It allows you to seamlessly integrate with open source libraries, spin up clusters, and build quickly in a fully managed Apache Spark environment with the global scale and availability of Azure. Question number 118. Which Azure service provides a set of version control tools to manage code? Your options are Azure Repos, Azure Cosmos DB, Azure Storage, Azure DevTest Labs. And the correct answer is option A, Azure Repos. Azure Repos is a set of version control tools that you can use to manage your code. Azure Repos provide 2 types of version control. The first one is Git-based, which is a distributed version control, and the other one is Team Foundation version control, which is a centralized version control. Let's look at next question. You have a virtual machine named VM1 that runs Windows Server 2019. VM1 is in Australia East Azure region. Which Azure service should you use from the Azure portal to view service failure notifications that can affect the availability of VM1? Your options are Azure Virtual Machines, Azure Service Fabric, Azure Monitor, Azure Advisor. And the correct answer here is Azure Monitor. It is a comprehensive monitoring solution for collecting, analyzing, and responding to telemetry from your cloud and on-premise environments. You can use Azure Monitor to maximize the availability and performance of your application and services. Question number 120 of the series. Which Azure storage access tier has the highest storage costs but the lowest access costs? Your options are hot tier, cool tier, cold tier, archive tier. And the correct answer is hot tier. There will be a lot of questions around storage in this part of the series, and you can expect to get some storage related questions in exam as well. So go through the link on your screen to understand about storage tiers in more details. If you have any questions around storage tiers, post them in the comment section and I'll try to answer them as soon as possible. Question number 121 of the series. Again, you have 4 options and you need to choose one of them which provides in-depth information about security, privacy, compliance offering, policies, and features across Microsoft Cloud products. Your options are Microsoft Trust Center, Microsoft Purview Compliance Portal, Microsoft 365 Defender Portal, Microsoft Defender for Cloud in Azure Portal. And the correct answer in this case is Microsoft Purview Compliance Portal. You might see different variations of this question on different places on internet. However, you just need to make sure that some of the services have their name changed recently, and this is the correct option and the recent name of the service, which is the right answer. Let's move to question number 122 of the series. Premium blob storage accounts only support which of the following redundancy? Your options are zero zone redundant storage, zero redundant storage, locally redundant storage, and zone redundant storage. The correct answer is option D, zone redundant storage. ZRS for premium blob accounts is available in a subset of Azure regions. Now there are 2 links on your screen to justify the answer that I have chosen. Go through that link and read about zone redundant storage in more detail. Question number 123 of the series. Which of the following can be used to enable just-in-time, or we also call it JIT VM access? Your options are Azure Firewall, Azure Bastion, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, Azure Front Door. And the correct answer in this case is option C, Microsoft Defender for Cloud. You can use Microsoft Defender for Cloud's just-in-time access to protect your Azure virtual machines from unauthorized network access. Many times firewalls contain allow rules that leave your VMs vulnerable to attack. JIT lets you allow access to your VMs only when the access is needed. Hence the name just-in-time access. And it allows the access on the ports needed and for the period of time the access is needed. Question number 124. What is the minimum recommended data retention period for archive access tier of Azure storage? Your options are 30, 60, 90, and 180. And the correct answer is 180. 180 days is the minimum recommended data retention period for archive access tier of Azure storage. Let's look at one more variation of this type of the question. What is the minimum recommended data retention period for cool access tier of Azure storage? Your options are 15, 30, 60, 90. In previous question, we were talking about archive access tier of Azure storage. And in this question, we are talking about cool access tier of the storage. And the correct answer is 30 days. So for archive tier, the minimum retention data period is 180 days. And for cool access tier, the minimum retention period is 30 days. Which service provides network traffic filtering across multiple Azure subscriptions and virtual networks? Your options are an application security group, a network security group, Azure Key Vault, Azure Firewall. The correct answer in this case is option D, Azure Firewall. This is one of the questions where other option, which is network security group, might sound correct to many of you. But remember, network security groups provide distributed network layer traffic filtering to limit traffic to resources within virtual networks in each subscription. Whereas Azure Firewall is a fully stateful centralized network firewall as a service, which provides network and application level protection across different subscriptions and virtual networks, which is what is being asked in this question, hence making Azure Firewall as the correct answer. Next question. You plan to extend your company's network to Azure. The network contains a VPN appliance that uses an IP address of 131.107.200.1. You need to create an Azure resource that identifies the VPN appliance. Which Azure resource should you create? Your options are local network gateway, application network gateway, virtual network gateways, load balancers. You need to read the words carefully here as the question is a bit tricky. VPN appliances hosted on-premise, and you need to create an Azure resource which identifies this appliance as you are extending your on-prem network to Azure. So the correct answer here is local network gateway. A local network gateway is a specific object that represents your on-premise location, which is your site for routing purposes. You give the site a name by which Azure can refer to it. Then you specify the IP address of the on-premise VPN device, which is VPN appliance in this case, to which you will create a connection. Question number 128 of the series. You are developing a web application that will be hosted on virtual machines. You start deploying virtual machines for hosting the application. You are deploying Azure virtual machines for hosting the application. Where in Azure portal will you be notified when the deployment of virtual machines is complete? Your options are navigate section, activity log section, notification section, view account section. The correct answer in this case is option C, notification section. As you can see a screenshot on the screen right now, which I took after creating a sample virtual machines for this demonstration. The bell icon is selected, which is the notification section, and you can see the message is being displayed here that the deployment is succeeded, and you have the link to browse to the resource group or to the individual resource as well. Let's move to next question of the series. Azure SQL database allows user to perform patch management of database software. You need to choose whether this statement is right or wrong. No, the statement is incorrect. Azure SQL database is an always up-to-date, fully managed relational database service built for the cloud. It is a PaaS offering. So you don't have access to underlying infrastructure. Whenever there is any service which is platform as a service, you don't have access to the underlying infrastructure to manage it, and that is all managed by Azure. So this is not the correct statement. I already have a detailed video around the differences between infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. If you are someone who is willing to understand these concepts in more detail, then I would highly recommend you to go through the video and post any doubts which you have in the comment section, and I'll be happy to answer them as soon as possible. Now let's have another yes or no question. Azure DevOps services allow developers to deploy or update applications to Azure using continuous integration and continuous delivery pipelines. Yes, this statement is correct. Azure Pipelines, which is a part of Azure DevOps service, lets you continuously build, test, and deploy to any platform and cloud. You can build, test, and deploy Node.js, Python, Java, PHP, .NET, Android, or even iOS apps and run them in parallel on Linux, Mac OS, and Windows operating system. Question number 131 of the series. To complete the sentence, select the appropriate option in the answer area. In the answer area, you have a statement: an organization that hosts its infrastructure, then dash, no longer requires a data center. Now you need to choose between in a private cloud, in a hybrid cloud, in a public cloud, on a Hyper-V host. So basically you need to choose a cloud hosting option in which the organization doesn't require a data center. So the correct answer in this case is public cloud. The other three options will still require you to manage your own data center in some or the other form. So for example, if you are talking about a private cloud, obviously private cloud is something which is hosted in a vendor's data center or your own data center, but still there is a data center. And in a hybrid cloud is again a combination of public cloud and your own data center or a private cloud. So again, your data center is involved, whereas public cloud is cloud native. So you don't need to manage your own data center. And a Hyper-V host again is an on-premise option, so you have to manage your data center. Let's move to question number 132. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. So let's start with first statement. Data transfers between Azure services located in different Azure regions is always free. No, the statement is incorrect. You are charged when you are moving data from one region to another region. Now on your screen, you can see a snippet from Microsoft website, which is telling about the different prices from transferring data from one region to another region. Prices vary whether you are doing an intercontinental data transfer or you are doing an intracontinental data transfer. But the bottom line is any transfer between regions is chargeable. Let's look at next statement. North America is represented by a single Azure region. No, this statement is again incorrect. North America has several Azure regions, including West US, Central US, South Central US, East US, and Canada East. Now, the third statement is every Azure region has multiple data centers. Yes, this statement is correct. Each Azure region features data centers deployed with a latency-defined parameter. They are connected through a dedicated regional low-latency network. This design ensures that Azure services within any region offer the best possible performance and security. Next question. Again, to complete a sentence, select the appropriate option in the answer area. Requiring a user to enter a password and answer a security question when signing into Azure Active Directory is an example of. Your options are managed identities, multi-factor authentication, role-based access control, business to customer identity services, which is B2C. So the correct answer is multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is a process in which users are prompted during the sign-in process for an additional form of identification, such as code on their cell phone or a fingerprint scan. Question number 134. Now you have a statement. Azure Key Vault is used to store app secrets, and the instructions are review the underlying text. If it makes the statement correct, select no changes needed. If the statement is incorrect, select the answer choice that makes the statement correct. Your options are no changes needed, Azure Security Center, Azure Repos, Azure Blob Storage. Yes, the statement is correct. So option A, no changes needed, is the right answer. Azure Key Vault is a cloud service for securely storing and accessing secrets. A secret is anything that you want to tightly control access to, such as API keys, passwords, certificates, or even cryptographic keys. Key Vault service supports two types of containers, vaults and managed hardware security module HSM pools. Moving on to question number 135. Which of the following can be used to view which user turned off a specific virtual machine during the last 14 days? Your options are Azure Event Hubs, Azure Activity Log, Azure Access Control, IAM, Azure Service Health. The correct answer in this case is option B, Azure Activity Log. Activity Monitor Log is a platform log in Azure that provides insight into subscription level events. The activity log includes information like when a resource is modified or a virtual machine is started. There is a similar event that is being talked about in this question when a virtual machine is turned off. You can view the activity log in the Azure portal or retrieve entries with PowerShell and the Azure CLI as well. So you do have option to access the activity logs through portal, which is GUI, or you can use CLI commands or PowerShell as well. Question number 136. What is used to grant permission to Azure Virtual Desktop resources? Your options are resource groups, application security groups, tags, role-based access control, RBAC roles. The correct answer in this case is option D, RBAC roles. Azure Virtual Desktop uses Azure RBAC to control access to resources. There are a number of built-in roles for use with Azure Virtual Desktop, which is a collection of permissions. You assign roles to users and admins, and these roles give permission to carry out certain tasks. You can refer to the link on your screen if you would like to understand more about RBAC roles and implement in your actual environments as well. Next question. To complete the sentence, select the appropriate option in the answer area. So you have four options: Azure Total Cost of Ownership Calculator, which is TCO calculator, Azure Migrate, Server Assessment Tool, Azure Pricing Calculator, Database Migration Assistant. Now the statement is Dash can calculate cost savings due to reduced electricity consumption as a result of migrating on-premise Microsoft SQL servers to Azure. The correct answer in this case is Azure TCO calculator, total cost of ownership calculator. It is used to estimate the cost savings you can achieve by migrating your application workloads to Microsoft Azure. Question number 138 of the series. Which of the following runs application code in Azure without requiring a server? So here we are talking about serverless computing. Your options are Azure Functions, an Azure DevOps pipeline, an Azure Resource Manager template, Azure Application Gateway. So as soon as we talk about serverless computing, what should come in your mind? Azure Functions. It is a serverless solution that allows you to write less code, maintain less infrastructure, and save on costs. Instead of worrying about deploying and maintaining servers, the cloud infrastructure provides all the up-to-date resources needed to keep your applications running. Azure Functions is one of the hot services in Azure. So if you are someone who is keen on exploring serverless computing, go ahead and check out the link on the screen to read more about Azure Functions. Let's look at question number 14th of the series. Select the answer that correctly completes the sentence. Azure Resource Manager templates use we are talking about ARM templates, and we need to choose what is the format of the ARM templates. Your options are CSV format, JSON format, HTML format, XML format. The correct answer is JSON format. ARM template is a JavaScript object notification, which is also called as JSON file, that defines the infrastructure and configuration for your project. The template uses declarative syntax, which lets you state what you intend to deploy without having to write the sequence of programming commands to create it. In the template, you specify the resources to deploy and the properties for those resources. Next question of the series. If an Azure virtual machine has a status of stopped or deallocated, then you will continue to pay for which of the following? Your options are storage, compute capacity, networking, input-output operations. When your VM is in deallocated state and you have any attached storage, you will be incurring the charge for that. Now, if you have a premium disk, you will incur charge for entirety of the volume size used or unused. But if you have a standard storage, you will only incur charge for the used space. What do you need to create before you create a new file share from the Azure portal? Your options are Azure Data Box, Resource Group, Azure Migrate, Storage Account. The correct answer in this case is storage account. Before you can work with an Azure file share, you must create an Azure storage account. A storage account is a shared pool of storage in which you can deploy an Azure file share or other storage resources such as blobs or queues. A storage account can contain an unlimited number of shares. A share can store an unlimited number of files up to the capacity limits of the storage account. Question number 142 of the series. You have an Azure web app. You need to manage the settings of the web app from an iPhone. What are two Azure management tools that you can use? You need to choose two options. Your options are Azure Portal, Windows PowerShell, Azure Storage Explorer, Azure Cloud Shell, Azure CLI. And the right answers in this case are option A and option D, Azure Portal and Azure Cloud Shell. Azure Portal is a web-based portal for managing Azure. Being web-based, you can use Azure Portal on an iPhone because it has a web browser. Similarly, Azure Cloud Shell is a web-based command line for managing Azure. You access the Azure Cloud Shell from the Azure Portal. Again, being web-based, you can access it from an iPhone. Let's now look at why other options are not correct. Windows PowerShell can be installed on Mac OS, but it cannot be installed on an iPhone, making it an incorrect choice. Azure Storage Explorer is not used to manage Azure web apps, so this is an irrelevant option here. Azure CLI can be installed on Mac OS, but again, it cannot be installed on an iPhone, making it an incorrect choice here. Question number 143 of the series. You need to configure an Azure solution that meets the following requirements. Now, the requirements are secure websites from attacks, generates reports that contain details of attempted attacks. What should you include in the solution? Your options are DDoS protection, Azure Firewall, Network Security Group, Azure Information Protection. And the correct answer in this case is option A, DDoS protection. A DDoS attack attempts to exhaust an application's resources, making the application unavailable to legitimate users. DDoS attacks can be targeted at any endpoint that is publicly reachable through the internet. Now, if you are someone who is interested in reading more about DDoS protection in Azure, then I would highly suggest you to go through the link on your screen to understand this in more details. If you have any questions, post them in the comment section and I'll attend them as soon as possible. Let's look at next question. Now you need to match the cloud service models to the appropriate offerings. To answer, just drag the appropriate model from the column on the left to its offering on the right. Each model can be used once, more than once, or not at all. Now the models are infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. And the three services that are being talked about here are Azure App Service, Azure Virtual Machines, and Microsoft Dynamics 365. The correct answer in this case is Azure App Service is an example of platform as a service, Azure Virtual Machine is an example of infrastructure as a service, and Microsoft Dynamics 365 is an example of software as a service. If you are not sure of the difference between these three types of cloud computing service models, then I already have a detailed video explaining all of them. Check that out, as there can be multiple questions around cloud computing service models in the exam. Question number 145. You can use Azure Active Directory to set permissions by dividing users into groups. You need to tell whether this statement is right or wrong. And this statement is correct. Azure Active Directory provides several ways to manage access to resources, applications, and tasks. With Azure AD groups, you can grant access and permissions to a group of users instead of for each individual users. Limiting access to Azure AD resources to only those users who need access is one of the core security principles of Zero Trust. So you need to understand here we are talking about Zero Trust, and Azure AD plays a big role in achieving that. Next question. Azure Logic Apps is a serverless solution for running code. Again, you need to tell whether this statement is right or wrong. And this statement is not correct. Azure Logic Apps is not a code execution solution like Azure Functions. If the question was Azure Functions is a serverless solution for running code, then you would have chosen yes. So there can be variation of this question. Now, Azure Logic Apps is a cloud platform where you can create and run automated workflows with little to no code. By using the visual designer and selecting from pre-built operations, you can quickly build a workflow that integrates and manages your apps, data, services, and systems. Next question of the series. You need to manage containers. Which of the two Azure services can you use? Your options are Azure Container Instances, Azure Virtual Machines, Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure Virtual Desktop, Azure Functions. And the correct answer in this case is option A and option C, Azure Container Services and Azure Kubernetes Service. Azure Container Instances provide a fast and simple way to run containers in Azure without having to manage virtual machines or worry about infrastructure. Azure Container Instances, also short form as ACI, is a fully managed service that makes it easy to run containers, and you can easily and quickly deploy containers to Azure with a single command. On the other hand, Azure Kubernetes Service, also called as AKS, is a managed Kubernetes service that makes it easy to deploy, manage, and scale containerized applications in Azure. With AKS, you can quickly and easily create and manage a fully managed Kubernetes cluster in Azure, which provides a scalable and highly available platform for running containers. Good thing about AKS is it also integrates with other Azure services to provide a complete solution for managing containers in Azure. Next question. Select the answer that correctly completes the sentence. After you create a virtual machine, you need to modify dash to allow connections to TCP port 8080 on the virtual machine. Your options are network security group, route table, virtual network gateway, or virtual network. And the correct answer in this case is network security group. You can use an Azure network security group to filter network traffic between Azure resources in a Azure virtual network. A network security group contains security rules that allow or deny inbound network traffic to or outbound network traffic from several types of Azure resources. For each rule, you can specify source and destination, port, and protocol. There are going to be many questions around network security groups in the exam, so go through the link on your screen to understand network security group in detail and how they differ from different network components in Azure. Question number 149 of the series. You need to purchase a third-party virtual security appliance that you will deploy to an Azure subscription. What should you use? Your options are Microsoft Defender for Cloud, Azure Subscriptions, Microsoft Store, or Azure Marketplace. The correct answer in this case is Azure Marketplace. There are many keywords in this question. You need to purchase a third-party virtual security appliance. So if you are trying to purchase anything in Azure, then the first place that you look for is Azure Marketplace. You can access enhanced network security features provided by a virtual security appliance by using an Azure partner solution. You can find the most current Azure partner network security solutions by visiting the Azure marketplace and searching for security and network security. Question number 150. An Azure service is no longer updated with new features after it becomes generally available. You need to tell whether this statement is right or wrong. This statement is incorrect. New features can be added to an Azure service after it becomes generally available, and they are usually released as updates. Each Azure service is constantly evolving and new functions are added as and when needed. Another question related to public preview or private or generally available things. When you create Azure resource for a service in public preview, you must recreate the resources once the service becomes generally available. You need to tell whether this statement is right or wrong. No, this statement is also incorrect. You don't need to recreate them. In most cases, the only thing that changes is you get formal support and defined SLAs when the service becomes generally available, also referenced as GA. Next question. Select the answer that correctly completes the sentence. Now you have four options, which is Azure Reserved Virtual Machine Instances, Azure Container Instances, Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets, Azure Spot Virtual Machine Instances. Which of the following provides access to Azure compute capacity at deep discounts? And the correct answer in this case is Azure Spot Virtual Machine Instances. They provide access to unused Azure compute capacity at deep discounts. Spot VMs offer the same characteristic as a pay-as-you-go virtual machine, the difference being pricing and evictions. Spot VMs can be evicted at any time if Azure needs capacity. So it is highly recommended whenever you are using spot virtual machines, you don't put production workloads on them, because as you would have just listened, they can be evicted at any time whenever Azure needs capacity. The only drawback is they can go anytime, but then you get a lot of discounts when you're using these virtual machines as well. So probably you can put your non-critical workloads on them, which can handle interruptions. Question number 153. Your company has multiple offices. You plan to generate several billing reports from the Azure portal. Each report will contain the Azure resource utilization of each office. Which Azure Resource Manager feature should you use before you generate the reports? Your options are policies, tags, logs, templates. And the correct answer in this case is option B, tags. You can use tags to group your billing data. If you are running multiple VMs for different organizations, for example, use the tags to group usage by cost center. You can also use tags to categorize costs by runtime environment, such as billing users for VMs running in the production environment. So there can be different use cases for tags, and tags are used a lot to segregate billing. There is a link on your screen now, which you can use to understand how tags and billing work together. Let's move to next question. At which OSI layer does Express Route operate? Your options are layer 2, layer 3, layer 5, layer 7. And the correct answer in this case is layer 3. It operates at network layer, which is layer 3 of OSI model.
If you are enjoying the content, friends, please hit the like button and subscribe the channel. Remember, if you would like to get access to the full set of questions in PDF format for quick revisions and offline study, then you can gain access to it by joining the channel as a gold member. And then you just need to email me at devopshub2023@gmail.com requesting your PDF copy. Let's now get back to the further questions of this video.
Next question. Which node in the Azure portal should you use to assign a user the reader role for a resource group? Now you have two screenshots on your screen from a resource group section, and you need to determine which section would you use when you want to assign a user the reader role for a resource group. And the correct answer in this case is access control. Usually, whenever you are doing anything which is related to access of the users or providing access to any resource, you play around in the access control IAM section of resource group or any other resource which you are playing around with. Our company is planning to deploy resources to Azure. They want to have the ability to manage user access to resources across multiple subscriptions. Which of the following can help you achieve this requirement? Your options are Azure policies, resource groups, Azure app service, management groups. Management group, which is at the top of hierarchy in Azure, helps you manage access policy and compliance for multiple subscriptions. All subscriptions in a management group inherit the conditions that are applied to the management group. A management group can be nested. Some basic examples of using multiple management groups can be production versus non-production workloads, internal services versus external services. In the screenshot, you can see we have root management group, under which we have some management groups for different departments, and then some subscriptions are also there in the first level of hierarchy, and the nesting of management group continues. If you are someone who is willing to understand more about hierarchy in Azure, what are management groups, what are subscriptions, then I already have a detailed video around this. Hop onto my channel and have a look at the video. Let's look at next question. Which of the following does a customer provide in a software as a service or SaaS model? Your options are application data, compute resources, application software, data storage. And the correct answer in this case is option A, application data. With SaaS, cloud providers host and manage the software application and underlying infrastructure. And they also handle any maintenance like software upgrades and security patching. Users connect to the application over internet, usually with a web browser on their phone, tablet, or PC. Question number 158 of the series. To complete the sentence, select the appropriate option in the answer area. Now you have a statement here. Your Azure trial account expired last week. You are now unable to. Then you have four options. Basically, your Azure trial account has expired last week, and you need to determine which of the listed activities you won't be able to perform. And the activities are access the Azure portal, create additional Azure Active Directory user accounts, access your data stored in Azure, start an existing Azure virtual machine. And the correct answer in this case would be start an Azure virtual machine. You won't be able to start an Azure virtual machine if your Azure trial account has expired. And the reason is a stopped or deallocated VM is offline and not mounted on an Azure host server. So when you try to start it, the VM mounts it on a host server before the VM starts. Now, as soon as the VM is mounted, it becomes chargeable. This is the reason why you are not able to start a VM after a trial has expired. Next question. You have an Azure environment that contains 10 virtual networks and 100 virtual machines. You need to limit the amount of inbound traffic to all the Azure virtual networks. What should you create? 10 virtual network gateways, 1 network security group, 10 Azure Express route circuits, 1 Azure firewall. Let's look at all options and see which one is right. So the first option is virtual network gateways. Now, virtual network gateways are used for connecting on-premise networks to Azure Virtual Network or for creating a site-to-site VPN connection. They do not provide inbound network traffic filtering or limiting for virtual networks. So this is not a correct option. The second option, network security groups, are used to control network traffic by defining inbound and outbound security rules. While NSGs can provide inbound traffic filtering for virtual machines, they do not directly limit the amount of inbound traffic to the entire virtual network, making this an incorrect choice. Now, the third option, Azure Express Route, they are dedicated private connections between your on-premise network and Azure. They are used for providing reliable and high bandwidth connectivity, but do not specifically address the need to limit inbound traffic to virtual networks, which makes it an incorrect choice, which leaves us with only one option, that is option D, Azure Firewall, making it the correct choice. Now, Azure Firewall is a cloud-native network security service that can provide centralized inbound and outbound traffic filtering and network address translation capabilities for multiple virtual networks. By deploying one Azure firewall, you can configure and enforce specific rules to restrict the amount of inbound traffic to all your virtual networks. Question number 160 of the series. You have an accounting application named App1 that uses a legacy database. You plan to move App1 to the cloud. Which service model should you use? Your options are software as a service, infrastructure as a service, or platform as a service. Now, given that you have a legacy database and wish to migrate it along with the application without significant changes, infrastructure as a service would be the most suitable service model here. I already have a detailed video around infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service, and what are the differences in each of them. If you are interested in reading, learning more about them, then again, go to the Azure Fundamental videos on my channel. Let's look at next question of the series. You need to collect and automatically analyze security events from Azure Active Directory. What should you use? Your options are Azure Synapse Analytics, Azure AD Connect, Azure Key Vault, Microsoft Sentinel. And the correct answer in this case is Microsoft Sentinel. It was formerly called as Azure Sentinel. It is a cloud-native security information and event management solution offered by Microsoft. It is specifically designed to provide intelligent security analytics and threat intelligence across your organization's entire hybrid infrastructure, including Azure AD. Microsoft Sentinel can collect security events, logs, and data from various sources, including Azure Active Directory. And it provides advanced security analysis, threat detection, and response capabilities. Next question. To complete the sentence, select the appropriate option in the answer area. Now, this statement is Azure Distributed Denial of Service Protection, DDoS protection, is an example of a protection mechanism implemented at. So basically, the question is about implementation of distributed denial of service protection, at which layer of OSI model it is implemented. Now, your options are application layer, compute layer, network layer, parameter layer. And the correct answer in this case is network layer. Question number 163. A support engineer plans to perform several Azure management tasks by using the Azure CLI. You install the CLI on a computer. You need to tell the support engineer which tools to use to run the CLI. Which two tools should you instruct the support engineer to use? Your options are Command Prompt, Windows Defender Firewall, Windows PowerShell, Azure Resource Explorer, Network and Sharing Center. And the correct answers in this case are option A and option C, Command Prompt and Windows PowerShell. Now, Command Prompt, or referred to as cmd.exe, as you would already know, is a command line interpreter in the Windows operating system. It provides a text-based interface for executing commands, including the Azure CLI commands. The support engineer can launch the command prompt and run the Azure CLI commands directly. And the second correct option, Windows PowerShell, is a powerful scripting environment that enables automation and task management. It provides a command line shell and a scripting language. The support engineer can again open Windows PowerShell and use it to execute Azure CLI commands. Let's look at question 164 of the series. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. So the first statement is, a DNS server that runs on an Azure virtual machine is an example of platform as a service. No, the statement is incorrect. A DNS server running on an Azure virtual machine is an example of infrastructure as a service. In infrastructure as a service, you have control over the virtual infrastructure where you manage the operating system, runtime environment, and applications running on the VM. In this case, you would deploy and configure a virtual machine on Azure to run the DNS server software, taking responsibility for the installation, maintenance, and management of the server. Now, the next statement is, Microsoft Intune is an example of software as a service. Yes, this statement is correct. As a SaaS offering, Microsoft Intune is delivered over the internet as a subscription-based service. Users can access and use Intune through a web portal or dedicated applications without the need for on-premise infrastructure or software installation. The next statement is, Azure Files is an example of infrastructure as a service. No, this statement is incorrect. Azure Files is not an example of infrastructure as a service, but rather a specific service offered by Microsoft Azure that falls under the category of platform as a service. Azure Files is a cloud-based file sharing service that allows you to create and manage file shares in the cloud. It provides a fully managed file storage solution that can be accessed from multiple virtual machines or services within Azure or even from an on-premise environment. So folks, you would have already seen that there are few questions around different type of these offerings, whether it is a platform as a service or infrastructure as a service or software as a service. So it is highly recommended you know what these cloud computing models are and you understand them in detail. So go through my video as you can expect to see some questions around this in the exam. Let's look at question 165 of the series. Which of the following Azure service should you use to store certificates? Your options are Azure Key Vault, Azure Information Protection, Azure Storage Account, Azure Security Center. And the Azure service that you should use to store certificates is Azure Key Vault. Azure Key Vault is a cloud-based service provided by Microsoft that is specifically designed for securely storing and managing cryptographic keys, secrets, certificates, and other sensitive information. It provides a central repository for storing certificates and offers features such as secure key management, policy-based access control, and integration with other Azure services. Now let's look at the purpose of other service and why they were not correct. Azure Information Protection is a service that focuses on protecting and classifying sensitive documents and emails rather than storing certificates. Now option C, Azure Storage Account, is a service used for storing and accessing various types of data, including blobs, files, tables, and queues. While it can be used for storing files and data, it is not designed specifically for certificate storage and management. Now, the last option, Azure Security Center, is a service that provides advanced threat protection for cloud workloads. While it offers security monitoring and recommendations, it is not intended for certificate storage. Next question. A company is planning on using their Microsoft Azure free account for hosting production-based resources. Does the Azure free account allow you to host production-based resources? You need to choose between yes or no. So the company is trying to use their free Microsoft Azure account to host production-based workloads. Though this is not a recommended practice, but you are allowed to do it. The Azure free account provides access to all Azure services and does not block customers from building their ideas into production. The Azure free account includes certain type of specific services and certain amounts of those services for free. But as I said, you can do it, but it is not recommended that you should be doing it. Let's look at another yes or no statement. A company wants to migrate some scripts to Microsoft Azure. They want to make use of the serverless features available in Azure. They decide to make use of Azure functions. Would this meet the requirement? You need to choose between yes or no. Yes, this would meet the requirement. Making use of Azure function would meet the requirement of utilizing serverless features available in Azure for migrating scripts. Now, by leveraging them, obviously you can migrate your scripts to Azure and take advantage of serverless architecture, which provides benefits such as automatic scaling, pay-per-use pricing, and simplified management. With Azure functions, you only pay for the actual execution time of your code, making it a cost-effective option for running scripts and small workloads. Question number 168 of the series. Which of the following are considered vertical scaling in a cloud environment? Your options are provision additional containers, increase the CPU and RAM of a virtual machine, increase the number of virtual machines, provision an additional Azure dedicated host. And the correct answer in this case is increase the CPU and RAM of the virtual machine, which is an example of vertical scaling. Now, vertical scaling, also known as scaling up or scaling vertically, refers to increasing the resources such as CPU, RAM, storage of an individual virtual machines or server to handle increased workloads or demands. It involves upgrading the capacity of a single instance rather than adding more instances. Now, option C, increasing the number of virtual machines, is an example of horizontal scaling. Go through the link on your screen to understand differences between horizontal and vertical scaling, as you can get some questions around this in exam. They are also referred to as scale up or scale down. So go through the link to understand these in more details. The question can talk about horizontal and vertical scaling, or it can even talk about scaling up or scaling down as well. Question number 169 of the series. A company wants to host a set of tables in Microsoft Azure. They want absolutely zero administration of the underlying infrastructure and low latency access to data. You recommend using the Azure Cosmos DB. Would this meet the requirement? You need to choose between yes or no. Yes, this will definitely meet the requirement. Azure Cosmos DB handles the underlying infrastructure management tasks such as provisioning, patching, and backups on behalf of the user. This allows developers and businesses to focus on building applications and accessing data without worrying about managing servers or infrastructure. Next question. A company is planning on setting up a solution in Microsoft Azure, and one of the key requirements is a tool that provides guidance and recommendations to improve an Azure environment. Which of the following would be best suited for this requirement? Your options are Azure Cognitive Services, Azure DevOps, Azure Application Insights, Azure Advisor. For the requirement of a tool that provides guidance and recommendations to improve an Azure environment, the best suited option would be Azure Advisor. It is a built-in Azure service that offers intelligent recommendations to optimize your Azure services or Azure resources. It provides proactive guidance across various areas, including cost optimization, performance, high availability, security, and operational excellence.
Your development team needs to maintain multiple versions of files in Azure Blob Storage for auditing purposes. Which Azure feature can help you achieve file versioning? Your options are Azure Blob Versioning, Azure Blob Snapshots, Azure Blob Lifecycle Management, Azure Blob Soft Delete. The feature that helps you achieve file versioning in Azure Blob Storage is Azure Blob Versioning. Azure Blob Versioning allows you to preserve and access previous versions of your blob data, providing a way to maintain and audit changes over time. Question number 172 of the series. You need to identify the type of failure for which an Azure availability zone can be used to protect access to Azure services. What should you identify? Your options are an Azure region failure, physical server failure, a storage failure, an Azure data center failure. And the correct answer here would be option D, Azure data center failure. Azure availability zones are designed to provide high availability and redundancy within a region, specifically protecting against failure at the data center level, which is what is being talked about here in this question. This means that if one data center within a region experiences any issue or failure, services can continue to operate from another availability zone within the same region, ensuring the availability and resilience of your Azure services. Next question. To reduce costs, your organization wants to automatically shut down VMs during non-business hours and start them up again in the morning. What Azure service should you configure for this purpose? Your options are Azure Policy, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Monitor, Azure Automation. To automatically shut down VMs during non-business hours and start them up again in the morning in Azure, you should configure Azure Automation. Azure Automation is a service that allows you to create, schedule, and automate various tasks and processes within your Azure environment. You can use Azure Automation to create runbooks, which are sets of scripts that can be executed on a schedule or in response to specific events. In this case, you can create a runbook that shuts down your VMs during non-business hours and another runbook to start them up in the morning, and then schedule these runbooks to run at the desired times. Question number 174. Your organization requires detailed auditing of who accesses and modifies data in Azure Blob Storage. Which Azure feature or service provides access logs and audit trails? The options are Azure Security Center, Azure Monitor, Azure Blob Storage Analytics, Azure Sentinel. The correct answer here would be option C, Azure Blob Storage Analytics. Azure Blob Storage Analytics includes the capability to track and log various types of storage operations and access to your blob data. You can configure it to capture metrics and logging data, including details of who accessed or modified data, when the access or modification occurred, and more. These logs can be useful for auditing and compliance purposes, helping you monitor and understand the activities related to your blob storage. Let's look at next question. Your company plans to migrate to Azure, and the company has several departments. All the Azure resources used by each department will be managed by a department administrator. What are two possible techniques to segment Azure resources for the departments? Now you need to choose two options here. And the given options are multiple Azure Active Directory directories, multiple subscriptions, multiple resource groups, multiple regions. To segment Azure for different departments, you can use multiple subscriptions and multiple resource groups. Each department can have its own subscription to isolate resources and billing, and within each subscription, you can further organize resources using different resource groups to manage and control access and permissions. Now let's look at why other options are not right. Multiple Azure Active Directory directories and multiple regions may not be necessary for segmentation in this context, although they can be used for other purposes such as identity management and geographic redundancy. Next question. You need to identify which blades in the Azure portal must be used to perform the following tasks. Now the tasks are: view security recommendations, monitor the health of Azure services. Which blade should you identify for each task? To answer, you need to select the appropriate options from the options mentioned below. Now for view security recommendations and monitor the health of Azure services, the blades that are given are monitor, subscription, marketplace, and advisor. So to view the security recommendations, the blade you would use is advisor. The advisor blade provides insights and recommendations for various aspects of your Azure resources, including security recommendations. It's where you can view and access security related recommendations and guidance. Now to monitor the health of Azure resources, the blade that you will use is monitor. The monitor blade provides tools and insights for monitoring the health and performance of Azure services and resources. You can use Azure Monitor and related features to track the health and performance metrics of your Azure environment. Let's now look at some yes or no questions, as you will see few of these questions in your exam as well. And the first one of them is, Azure DevOps service includes a Git repository for developers to store code. So basically what's happening here is you are given a statement related to Azure DevOps services and you need to tell whether that statement is right or wrong. So what they are asking is, Azure DevOps service includes a Git repository for developers to store code. Yes, that's correct. The Azure DevOps service includes a Git repository where developers can store and manage their code. Azure DevOps services provides version control and source code management capabilities through Git, allowing teams to collaborate on code development and track changes effectively. Let's look at next statement. If you implement the security recommendation provided by Azure Advisor, your company's secure score will increase. You need to tell whether this statement is right or wrong. Yes, this statement is again correct. If you implement the security recommendations provided by Azure Advisor, your company's secure score in Azure will typically increase. Azure Advisor offers recommendations and best practices to improve the security, performance, and reliability of your Azure resources. Following these recommendations can enhance the overall security posture of your Azure environment, which often leads to an increased secure score. Let's look at next statement. An Azure reservation is used to reserve server capacity at a specific data center. No, this statement is incorrect. Azure reservation is not used to reserve server capacity at a specific data center. They are used to reserve and prepay for certain Azure resources or services over a specific term, such as virtual machines, databases, or other services. However, they do not specify the location or data center where the resources will be provisioned. The allocation of resources is managed by Azure, and the resources may be deployed in any of the Azure available data center based on factors like availability, resource availability, and region selection. So folks, if you have any doubts till now, please don't hesitate to post them in the comments section and we will get back to you with necessary answers. If we are not able to get back to you, then comment section is a very good place to interact with the community and help each other grow. Let's look at next question. Who should take the lead in developing and implementing a disaster recovery plan for applications running on Azure virtual machines? Your options are Microsoft Azure, customer, third-party provider, Azure Site Recovery Service. The customer is responsible for developing and implementing a disaster recovery plan for their application on Azure VMs. So the correct answer is option B, customer. Let's look at question 181 of the series. Your company stores sensitive customer data in Azure. Which Azure service helps you automatically classify and label data based on its sensitivity to enforce data protection policies? Your options are Azure Purview, Azure Monitor, Azure Policy, Azure Key Vault. The Azure service that helps you automatically classify and label data based on its sensitivity to enforce data protection policy is Azure Purview, which is option A here. Azure Purview is a data governance service that provides capabilities for discovering, classifying, and cataloging data across your organization, including sensitive data, and then allows you to apply policies and manage access to the data based on its classification and sensitivity. Next question. A company needs to create around 50 customized virtual machines. Out of these, 20 are Windows-based virtual machines and 30 are Ubuntu machines. Which of the following would help reduce the administrative effort required to deploy the machines? Your options are Azure Web Apps, Azure Load Balancer, Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets, Azure Traffic Manager. And the correct answer here is option C, Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets. Also called as Azure VMS, is designed for deploying and managing a set of identical VMs which can be automatically scaled in or out based on demand. It's suitable for scenarios where you want to minimize administrative effort, ensure high availability, and maintain consistency across VM instances. Question number 183. Which of the following can be used to help you enforce resource tagging so you can manage billing? Choose two. You need to choose two options, and the question is asking about how can you enforce resource tagging so that you can manage billing. The options are Compliance Manager, Azure Service Help, Azure Policy, Azure Security Center, and Azure Management Groups. To enforce resource tagging and effectively manage billing in Azure, you can use either Azure Policy or Azure Management Groups. Azure Policy allows you to create and enforce policies that can require specific tags to be applied to resources. By defining tagging policies, you ensure that resources are consistently tagged with relevant metadata, making it easier to allocate cost and manage billing. When it comes to Azure Management Group, they allow you to organize your subscription into a hierarchy and apply policies at different levels, including the root level. You can use management groups to enforce tagging policies across multiple subscriptions, ensuring consistency in tagging for billing purposes. Folks, I already have a detailed video around policies and management groups, which are uploaded on the channel. If you are interested in knowing more about policy and management groups, go and check out those videos. Meanwhile, let's look at question number 184 of the series. A company wants to have an enterprise messaging solution integrated with their existing application hosted within Microsoft Azure. Which of the following should the company use for this requirement? Your options are API Management Services, Logic Apps, API Connections, Service Bus. For an enterprise messaging solution integrated within an existing application hosted within Azure, Azure Service Bus is the most appropriate choice. Azure Service Bus is a cloud messaging service that enables reliable communication between applications and services. It provides features like publish, subscribe, queuing, and message routing, making it an ideal choice for building scalable and robust messaging solutions. Next question. In the shared responsibility model, who is typically responsible for conducting compliance audits to ensure that Azure services meet regulatory requirements? Your options are Microsoft Azure, customer, a third-party provider, or regulatory authorities. And the correct answer here is a third-party provider. Audits are often conducted by third-party providers or regulatory authorities, but the customer is responsible for ensuring their own compliance. Question number 186 of the series. Your company hosts an accounting application named App1 that is used by all the customers of the company. App1 has low usage during the first 2 weeks and very high usage during the last 2 weeks of each month. Which benefit of Azure Cloud supports cost management for this type of usage pattern? Your options are high latency, elasticity, high availability, load balancing. And the correct answer here is elasticity. Elasticity in cloud computing allows you to automatically scale your resources up or down based on demand. This elasticity feature helps in cost management because you only pay for the resources you actually use. When the usage is low, you are not paying for access capacity, and when it's high, you are scaling up effectively and efficiently to meet the demand without incurring unnecessary costs. Select the appropriate answer choice which completes the sentence correctly. An organization that hosts its infrastructure, and your options are in a private cloud, in a public cloud, in a hybrid cloud, on a Hyper-V host, no longer needs to maintain a data center. So basically the requirement is to get rid of maintenance of their own data center. And you can achieve this in a public cloud. Public cloud is a type of cloud computing model in which computing resources such as virtual machine, storage, and services are provided over the internet by a third-party cloud service provider like Azure, AWS, GCP, and many more. Question number 188. You plan to provision infrastructure as a service resources in Azure. Which of the following resource is an example of infrastructure as a service? Your options are Azure Virtual Machine, Azure Logic App, Azure Web App, Azure SQL Database. And the correct answer here is Azure Virtual Machine, which is an example of infrastructure as a service. Infrastructure as a service provides virtualized computing resources over the internet. In the case of an Azure virtual machine, it allows you to provision virtualized hardware such as CPU, memory, storage, and networking, where you have full control over the operating system and software running on it. This means you are responsible for managing and maintaining the operating system and any applications installed on the virtual machine, similar to how you would manage physical servers in a traditional on-premise data center. So folks, if you don't know the differences between the different cloud computing models, which is infrastructure as a service or platform as a service and software as a service, then I already have a detailed video on this, which is available in the description section of this video. If you would like to know more about these cloud computing models, go through the video. Question number 189 of the series. You have an on-premise network that contains 100 servers and you need to recommend a solution that provides additional resources to your users. The solution must minimize capital and operational expenditure costs. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are a private cloud, an additional data center, a complete migration to public cloud, a hybrid cloud. You need to add 100 more servers and you need to minimize capital and operational expenditure costs. So to minimize it, you would be using a hybrid cloud. All the other options will provide additional resources. However, the keyword here in this question is minimize capital and operational expenditure, which is minimum when moving to a hybrid cloud model. Question number 190 of the series. You are planning to deploy numerous web and database servers to Azure. You need to create a strategy that allows for connection types between the web and database servers to be controlled. You include use of network security groups in your strategy. Does the solution meet the goal? Yes, it meets the goal. NSGs allow you to define inbound and outbound rules to filter network traffic to and from Azure resources. This can help you enhance security and control access between your servers. However, the effectiveness of your strategy also depends on how you configure the NSGs and other security measures you put in place. Next question. You can use Service Trust Portal to download published audit reports and how Microsoft builds and operates its cloud services. Yes, this statement is also correct. You can use Service Trust Portal to download published audit reports and learn about how Microsoft builds and operates its cloud services. The Service Trust Portal is a Microsoft Azure website that provides various compliance and security related documentation, including audit reports, certifications, and other information related to Microsoft Cloud services. Within the Service Trust Portal, you can access information such as SOC, which is Service Organization Control Reports, ISO certifications, GDPR data protection impact assessments, and other compliance-related documents. These reports and certifications provide insight into Microsoft adherence to security and compliance standards and offer transparency regarding the security and privacy of their cloud services. Next question. You plan to migrate a web application to Azure, and the web application is accessed by external users. You need to recommend a cloud deployment solution to minimize the amount of administrative effort used to manage the application. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or database as a service. To minimize administrative effort when migrating a web application to Azure, you should recommend using platform as a service. Because you are migrating an existing application, so you can't really use software as a service because the application already exists. Whereas with software as a service, you are using a service or application provided by a third-party vendor. So the most appropriate choice here is platform as a service. Next question. You have a resource group named RG1. You plan to create virtual networks and app services in RG1. You need to prevent the creation of virtual machines only in RG1. The solution must ensure that other objects can be created in RG1. What should you use? So you need to create virtual networks and app services in RG1, and you need to prevent the creation of virtual machines only in RG1. So what would you use? Your options are an Azure policy, a lock, an Azure role, a tag. To prevent creation of virtual machines, specifically in a resource group, you can use Azure policy. Azure policies are a type of resource governance mechanism that allows you to enforce specific rules and conditions on your Azure resources. In this case, you can create a custom Azure policy that denies the creation of virtual machines in the specified resource group, which is RG1 in the case. Next question. You have an Azure virtual network named VNet1 in a resource group named RG1. You assign an Azure policy specifying that virtual networks are not an allowed resource type in RG1. VNet1 is deleted automatically. Now the instructions are given that you need to select no change is needed. If the statement is incorrect, select the answer choice that makes the statement correct. There is a underlying text here, and the underlying text is VNet1 is deleted automatically. So the question is talking about you create a Azure policy which will restrict the creation of virtual networks in RG1. But there is already a virtual network VNet1 existing in RG1. So what will happen to VNet1? And in the question, it specifies VNet1 is deleted automatically. You need to tell whether this is right or wrong. Now the options are no change is needed. VNet1 becomes a read-only object. VNet1 is moved automatically to another resource group. VNet1 continues to function normally. Assigning an Azure policy that specifies virtual networks are not allowed in the resource group does not automatically delete or move existing virtual networks. It only enforces the policy on new resource creations or updates. So basically, if you try to create a virtual network after the policy has been applied, you won't be able to do that, but there will be no change to any existing resource. So the correct answer is option D. VNet continues to function normally. Existing resources will continue to function normally as usual, as I said, until you manually delete them or policy has a remediation action to delete the non-compliant resources. So it depends how you have configured your policy. But generally, there is no remediation plan attached to it by default. So you will have to exclusively create a remediation plan to delete the non-compliant resources. What does the term Azure Policy Initiative refer to? Your options are collection of Azure policy definition assignments, group of role-based access controls, collection of policy definitions, group of Azure blueprint definitions. The term Azure Policy Initiative refers to collection of policy definitions. Azure Policy Initiative allows you to group multiple policy definitions together for easier management and enforcement. This can be particularly useful when you have a set of related policies that need to be applied to your Azure resources. By creating an initiative, you can enforce these policies as a group, making it more streamlined to ensure that your resources comply with a set of specific compliance and governance requirements. Let's look at next question. One of the benefits of Azure Synapse Analytics is that high availability is built into the platform. Then you have the instructions like one of the previous questions, review the underlying text. If it makes the statement correct, select no changes needed. If the statement is incorrect, select the answer choice that makes the statement correct. Your options here are no changes needed, versioning, automatic scaling, and data compression. This statement is correct. Azure Synapse Analytics is a PaaS offering, which is platform as a service offering and is designed with high availability in mind. But its specific level of availability can depend on the configuration and redundancy choices you make while configuring it. A company is planning on setting up a solution in Microsoft Azure. The solution would have the following key requirement, and the requirement is provides a platform for creating workflows. Which of the following would be best suited for this requirement? Your options are Azure App Service, Azure Application Insights, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Databricks. For providing a platform for creating workflows, Azure Logic Apps is the best choice. Azure Logic Apps is a cloud service that allows you to create and run workflows that can integrate with various Azure services and external services. It's designed specifically for building workflows, automating tasks, and orchestrating processes. You can use it to create and manage complex workflows easily without the need of extensive coding. Question number 198 of the series. You plan to create an Azure virtual machine and you need to identify which storage service must be used to store the unmanaged data disks of the virtual machine. Which of the following would you identify? Your options are queues, file shares, tables, and containers. You should use containers for this use case. Specifically, you would use Azure Blob Storage containers to store these unmanaged data disks. Blob storage is suitable for storing objects such as VHD files that are used as data disks for Azure virtual machines, which is what is asked in the question here. Next question. Which of the following is a repeatable set of governance tools that helps development teams quickly build and create new environments while adhering to organizational compliance to speed up development and deployment? Your options are CI/CD pipeline, Azure Blueprints, Azure DevOps, Azure Policy. The correct answer here would be Azure Blueprints. Azure Blueprints is a service in Microsoft Azure that allows organizations to define a repeatable set of governance tools, including role assignments, policies, and resource templates, to ensure that development teams can quickly build and create new environments while adhering to organizational compliance requirements. It streamlines the deployment of resources and configurations in a consistent and compliant manner. Question number 200 of the series. How many management groups can be supported in a single directory? Your options are 10, 100, 1000, or 10,000. And the correct answer here is option D, 10,000. There are certain limits that apply when dealing with management groups in Azure. One of them is what is being talked about in this question. Some of the other limits are a management group tree can support up to 6 level of depth. Each management group can only support one parent. I already have a detailed video around management groups and hierarchy in Azure. If you would like to understand this in more detail, then look out for the video on the channel whose link is also available in the description section. Great job making it this far. You have just completed 200 Azure Fundamentals practice questions, and that's a big step towards passing the AZ-900 exam. But remember, this is just first part of our full series with over 500 exam style questions. To get the maximum benefit and cover every important topic, make sure to continue with the next parts as well. If you found this helpful, do not forget to like this video, subscribe the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the upcoming sessions. Have any doubts or need clarity on a question? Drop it in the comments. I'm here to help you succeed. Keep going, stay consistent, and I'll see you in the next part. Let's pass AZ-900 together.